The Earth is Biosphere 1. This is Biosphere 2. Biosphere 2 is an incredible tool in the hands of amazing scientists
that is dedicated to understanding the effects and impacts of global climate change.
To help us anticipate what are the possible responses of landscape-scale ecosystems to major changes in the dynamics associated with climate, particularly water and temperature.
So the consequences of global climate change, which the UN has already warned us about in the most explicit of ways, we can study here. And we can also think about how to ameliorate those consequences.
So the culmination of the changes of the climate over the past 3.5 decades I've been here are really coming to bear on us in very harsh terms right now.
When we think of the Earth, we think of Earth systems, all interplaying with each other. And that's precisely what happens here at Biosphere 2. You don't just look at a system in isolation, you can link them all together to see what happens.
The key is to be able to adapt. In order to be able to adapt, we have to understand what's coming our way. Without a facility like Biosphere 2, it makes some of those predictions much more difficult. But we really have an opportunity to provide insight in ways that other facilities can't, but very much complement the world's observatories and laboratories.
There's this incredible combination of the ability to do very large-scale, yet controlled studies on uniquely controlled ecosystems. There is no place else like it in the world.
Some of the conditions that we currently see facing us, whether it's the increased temperature in coral reefs, the droughts in tropical forests, increased desertification, they're happening right now, and they're continuing to progress.
Well, here they are running those exact experiments to see how those systems will recover.
Each of these systems can be precisely controlled so that we can conduct experiments to understand the impacts of global climate change.
You go into a laboratory like B2, and you're saying, here are the factors that we think are driving this change. And we can then monitor those, sort of model or alter those parameters, CO2, temperature, et cetera, other trace gases in the atmosphere, and then see what happens and see if indeed those changes in those parameters in the atmosphere in B2 translate to a change consistent with what we're seeing in the field.
Biodiversity loss is a true crisis. Emitting carbon into the atmosphere is a true existential crisis. If we don't do both of those at once, while maintaining some kind of equity or trying to make sure that what we do doesn't make inequities in the world worse, we are on our way.
Inside Biosphere 2 is a tropical ocean system. And what's unique about this is we can control all of the variables. We can control the temperature, we can control the water chemistry. And this system is different from your typical aquarium in that we are willing to push the boundaries of this system to understand the response of the organisms. And not just a single organism, but the entire community.
So unfortunately, as you all know, we are in really dire straits and at risk of losing our coral reefs entirely if we continue to do nothing about climate change. So today we've estimated to have lost already about 50% of the world's reefs. And so we're really at the point as a coral reef community where we need to really be moving into action. And so we have really developed innovative solutions for restoring what we call resilient reefs. So reefs that can persist through climate change and disturbances. It may not look like the reefs of today, but will still provide that critical goods and services to humanity. Behind me is a really unique opportunity to actually test those solutions before they're applied in the wild. In my work, we've learned that corals that do get hit frequently by stress events, so they get warming frequently, tend to do better when these warm events return. So they then bleach less severely during subsequent events. So we can actually use that to our advantage and do something we call stress hardening, which is we turn up the temperature, we stress the corals out, and we increase their resistance to temperature stress. We can then restore reefs with these stress hardened corals and those corals are more likely to survive subsequent heat stress events.
The Biosphere 2 rainforest is 35,000 cubic meters. It's 28 meters at its tallest point. It has over 100 plant species, and we can control every variable, from temperature to carbon dioxide to even the rain that's starting to come down right now.
I've been studying tropical rainforests for 20 years, mostly in the Amazon of Brazil, but also here in Biosphere 2. And these are fully assembled ecosystems. But what we really are able to do now in Biosphere 2 is to start from scratch, to build the Landscape Evolution Observatory, which allows us to assemble a complex ecosystem from scratch. And here we have the Landscape Evolution Observatory, LEO, our laboratory for understanding how ecosystems function.
So it rains in the mountains. How much water ends up downstream? What impacts the quality of that water? These are questions that we struggle with every day. The Landscape Evolution Observatory was specifically designed to try to shed light on some of those critical questions. As a landscape evolves, how does the movement of water change? As you add vascular plants, how does that further complicate the system? And can we actually develop tools that allow us to better predict, so people like water managers and city managers, for example, know how much water they're going to have as we move into the future?
The optimistic story is that biological systems are resilient, more resilient than we have often imagined, but that there is a limit to that resilience. And if we don't act soon to stop the changes that we're imposing on this globe and this planet, then we will lose the opportunity that biology is giving us to save it.
All around us, we've been able to see these different climate pressures show up in our natural ecosystems, and more we're hearing about how climate change is impacting things that we need to live, the food that we want to eat, the water that we need to grow that food, and the energy for heating and cooling. In this system, I like to say we're harvesting the sun twice. In the overstory, we're collecting renewable energy, and it's providing shade for the plants growing below. The plants are growing in that shadier environment so they don't get that midday stress that really harms plants, really slows down their production. In exchange for that, just like we perspire and lose water and it cools off our skin, plants transpire, and that cooling of the atmosphere actually cools the solar panels overhead, which makes them even more efficient. And the last part of that is the shade in this environment reduces the evaporation of the moisture from the soil, which means the water stays in the ground longer and does the work that we brought it here to do, which is grow plants. One of the biggest benefits from agrivoltaics comes in terms of water savings. And we've found by growing food in this agrivoltaics environment, we can cut back half the water and still not see any impact in terms of the production. So what that tells me is that we can cut back more than half the water before we start to see real reductions. So we haven't even seen the full potential in terms of water savings. And so in terms of what's next, in our next spring growing season, we're going to switch up our irrigation system and have it be plant driven. You know, when the plants draw down that soil moisture, our soil moisture sensors will detect that, and that will trigger the irrigation. That'll be the way that we actually calculate how much water does it take to sustain food in an agrivoltaic system versus a controlled system.
One of the important things is the question, is there hope? And I think the lesson from biology is, yes, biological systems are more resilient than we give them credit for, and we're learning all the ways in which biology has ways to cope with stresses and problems of climate change.
Biosphere 2 offers an opportunity to understand, first and foremost, what is the resiliency and the boundaries for some of these systems. But it also provides information of ultimately where are some of those tipping points.
And I have hope because I have seen reefs recover. I have seen evidence for reef recovery, but we need to give them that time by addressing climate change and coming together as a coral reef community to develop some of these solutions in real time.
There is absolutely hope. We are an adaptive species. We are seeing that the systems inside Biosphere 2 are showing us that in some cases they have greater resiliency than what we had initially anticipated. And because of that, that does give me hope. But just because we have hope does not mean that we can stop these efforts. We have to continue to forge forward and understand the implications. What are the resiliency and those boundary layers for these systems? Because knowing that is going to allow us to adapt and make changes to allow us to have long-term sustainability.
I have hope, and you should have hope, that the work that's being done here will be beneficial both to our generation and the next.
It gives the policymaker an opportunity to have additional information available to them that then in turn they can use to shape policy so that we don't reach those tipping points.
And no other time, I think, in Earth's humanity has that connection between the public and private sector and educational sector has been so important. Because the changes that are going to have to be made are going to be driven by policy and scaled up by business.
The question really is, how long will those solutions last? And can they be passed down to other generations? And we don't know the answers to those questions. And we don't know how these solutions will survive under future ocean conditions. And that's where the Biosphere 2 comes in, because we can actually simulate what oceans will experience, not just today, but 10, 20, 30, 40 years into the future.
What I see right now that's important for us to be doing is to take that information, and B2 gives you a chance to do it. What does the basic science say? And how does it really translate to the real world? B2 is a step in that translational process. So I see B2 as a nice tool in the translational science.
We know the issues that we need to solve. We also know the issues are solvable.
The biosphere, it's like an icon of possibilities.
Where do we go from here? Well, the scientists will continue to experiment. They will continue to understand Earth systems. And at the end of the day, those experiments will inform the way that our governments, that our people, that we as citizens of Earth must steward Biosphere 1.
And Annika Saarikko, who's the Minister of Finance for Finland. I believe that Minister Saarikko may have to leave a few minutes early, and I think that the Honourable Nigel Clark may or may not be here at the moment, but will join. As I say, this is truly diplomacy in motion in a very physical and metaphorical sense. So, over to you, Minister Blasberg.
Hi, good to see you. Hi.
Good to see you.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Minister, hi, good to see you. Hey, how are you? So.
Hi again.
So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, excellencies, friends, really a pleasure to kick off our debate at this ministerial, high-level ministerial dialogue. This is part of the long-term finance work program. We discussed it back in the at the COP 2013 in Warsaw. And since then, starting in 2014, we have this series of ministerial high-level dialogues to follow up on where we are on climate finance, especially with regard to the promise from Copenhagen in 2009, the 100 billion. And as you might know, my dear colleague Jonathan Wilkinson from Canada and I had been tasked by our president, Alok Sharma, to work on the 100 billion delivery plan. So why do we have to work on a 100 billion delivery plan? Obviously, because the 100 billion were not there when they were expected. In 2020, we have the latest figures from OECD. I saw Matthias Kormann somewhere. There he is, and with the wonderful work of the OECD. We have credible numbers, but unfortunately they were too low. In 2019, they came up to 80 billion, which is not an issue for the OECD. On the contrary, it's not the fault of your organization, but the developed countries missed the target in due time. And that was the background for Alok to ask us to work on that, to outline where we are at the moment, and also what we can expect in the near future. So what we did over the last months since the ministerial in London, since July, we pushed everybody whom we could grab from the developed world, also the banks, to increase their climate finance, to do more, to come up with new pledges. And what appeared to me as a mission impossible turned out to be a successful race to this COP. We saw tremendous additional pledges. And what you can see in Jonathan's and my report is that we will miss a target in 2020 and 21, certainly, but with increasing figures, and that we will touch to the 100 billion in 2022. With a bit of luck, we might cross it, and in 2023, we will cross it and increase to, well, in our report, you will find the figure of 117 billion, 17 billion, but we luckily heard some late announcements the last days. For example, Japan yesterday with another 10 billion in this period of time. Also Norway came up with something. And I want to encourage everybody to not stop looking for more money to well, reach the target earlier and to overachieve it later on. So in an average, that is the message from Jonathan and I, is in an average we will meet the target in the time between 2020 and 25. And my message to this room is there is no reason for developed countries to be specifically proud, because at the end still we did not deliver in due time. But on the other side, my message to our friends and partners from developing countries is also that this is not a reason to be extremely disappointed and to be in a mood of mistrust, because at the end the 100 billion will come and we will overachieve them, and I think that is a fair basis for our discussion, and that is what we kick off here. And I have been asked to moderate it a bit, and my key duty is, apart from listening to your very valuable contributions, to keep us in the time limits of 3 minutes each. And you all know that Germans can do crazy things if we are getting out of time. So with this, I want to start, and I'm extremely happy to be accompanied by my colleagues here. And the first one I will give the floor is our good friend from the African Development Bank, Akinwumi Adesina. Akinwumi, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to see you, and thanks for all your great work. I think when we talk about the issue of $100 billion a year in climate financial flows to developing countries, it needs to come from a mix of resources, existing and new public resources. And we have to do everything to make sure that we can do energy transition, but let's not do financing transition. So let's just make sure that we keep the promise of what we said. Kofi Annan told me when I was working with him, God bless his soul, that the only promises that matter are the promises that are kept. At the African Development Bank, we are playing our role. We have doubled our climate finance to $25 billion by 2025, and we will be devoting 40% of our financing to climate. But also, we are paying greater attention to adaptation. 2018, we had actually surpassed the parity of 50-50. By 2019, we were basically at 55% of our financing for climate adaptation, and by 2020, we were at 63% for adaptation. So that's really great for us, and we're the first multilateral development bank to actually achieve and surpass that particular target. The bank also is working very closely with the Global Center for Adaptation to launch the African Adaptation Acceleration Program to raise $25 billion for adaptation for Africa. But it's not just adaptation alone, mitigation also matters. We have launched a $20 billion project called the Desert to Power to try and develop 10,000 megawatts of electricity all across the Sahel of Africa that will give electricity for 250 million people and conserve a lot of carbon resources. And let me use that opportunity to thank my dear brother and friend Glemerek here from the Green Climate Fund for the great support of $150 million. And so I can give you that's very, very important for us. But let me also say that there are other innovations that we must do. We need to optimize our balance sheet. And so, we've been doing this at the African Development Bank, and I'm very delighted that the UK government provided us, announced by the Prime Minister, $2 billion of guarantee facilities that will allow us to do what we call room to run, which is basically sweat our balance sheet and use our money to leverage more resources for climate financing. But even if we get $100 billion, the key is which projects are we going to put them in? So I want to just say that we need to actually continue to work and make sure project development facilities are there. We have that, Africa 50 has that we can develop bankable projects. But I also want to say that it's important for us to support the countries. We can align to Paris, but if the countries don't have resources to do their updated national determined contributions or their long-term strategies, we will not be able to have convergence and actually fund them. And the last thing I wanted to say is that, and when we do that, they'll be able to come to you and get access to financing from their funds. And finally, is the issue of the SDRs. The SDRs, we have them on the table, right? I want to make a case that in addition to the SDRs being used right now for the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust of the IMF and also the Resilience Fund, some of those SDRs should be reallocated or allocated, let me say, assigned to African Development Bank and others that have prescribed holders, that have been prescribed holders of SDRs. Why? First, we can leverage it. We can leverage the SDRs at the African Development Bank 4 times to $50 billion become $200 billion. That's what it's going to take to reach the numbers that we are talking about. And lastly, just to close, we need to shift from billions to trillions, because that's what's going to take to really save our planet. The British normally say, let's not be penny wise and pound foolish. Let's do the right thing and save our world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And with this, I pass to our good friend Yannick Glemerek, has been mentioned already from the Green Climate Fund, and interested to listen to your view, but maybe you also want to echo what we just heard. Specifically, I would be interested in the SDR points, what your view on that is. Please, Yannick.
I was not planning to address the SDR, but I will accept your invitation, Minister. The distinguished participants, dear colleagues, it's a great opportunity to be able to participate in this discussion. As a number of you will recall, GCF was established in 2010 and received an initial capitalization in 2014-2015. Last year, we have programmed for almost $3 billion of project. We have doubled our annual programming capacity and tripled the number of projects under implementation over the past 18 months in order to assist developing countries in their effort to maintain climate ambition in the context of COVID-19. Today, we have $37 billion of assets under management, including $10 billion of GCF co-financing. We have adopted a 4-pronged approach in order to scale up and increase the effectiveness of climate finance. Our first prong is to assist developing countries in establishing a conducive environment for climate action. And this might mean removing barriers to novel ideas, optimizing development co-benefits, adaptation and mitigation action through, for example, supporting integrated planning, integrated strategies, integrated policy development. Our second prong is to accelerate innovation. And the technological innovation, policy innovation, business innovation. And for that, we can support incubators and accelerators. We can provide early financing to climate innovators in developing countries. We will not address climate change without supporting climate innovators in developing countries. The third prong is that once you have a functional solution, how do you bring it to commercial scale? And for that, we use limited public resources, that we blend with private investment to basically de-risk this market-creating projects and crowd in private finance, and establish a commercial track record. Once we have this commercial track record, the next stage is to enable all domestic financial institutions, public and private, to basically be able to originate this kind of solution and access capital markets to finance them. The cooperation, coherence is critical among the different actors. For me, one of the key added value of climate funds is that we act as hubs. We work with more than 200 delivery partners. And so we can basically create unique coalition of different type of players. And GCF tried to, because we are capital agnostic, we try to basically act as the fund that can provide exactly the type of financing that our partners need to finalize the syndicate. And we have some superb example with, for example, the African Development Bank for desert to power. On the SDR, I was not planning to discuss it. GCF is not a prescribed holder of SDR, but it's a discussion we have had with a number of governments who have been asking us over the past couple of months to consider becoming a prescribed holder.
Thanks a lot. And with this, we come from the financial institutions to a country. And it's my pleasure to welcome Annika Saarikko, the Minister of Finance from Finland. Finland is a champion in multilateralism and cooperation, so very interested to hear your view.
Thank you, Jochen, and thanks for the colleagues, also for the wise opinions and good remarks on this important topic. It is good to have this kind of discussions here, and especially I'm happy to have this kind of finance day where many ministers of finance from different countries, we can meet here and have the discussions also on the table where we were sitting together as a coalition for finance ministers. A few words about that later, but somehow I think that I'm here in two different kind of roles, two different kind of positions and roles which I have here. First of all, as the Finnish minister and member of our government, I stress that Finland, for us it is highly important that the 100 billion target is met. And I have 2 points on this, why it is important. First, Finland, Nordic small country, we will support developing countries' climate action by 900 million euros until 2025. And second, Finland has recently joined the declaration of the OECD on the principles on climate finance. And I'm happy and proud of both of those things. But as I mentioned, I'm here also as a co-chair of the Coalition of Finance Ministers, and we had the meeting here today. And through these glasses, I look at the issues more broadly, of course. Our aim in that coalition of finance ministers for climate action, the goal is to find tools and practices to enhance the current system so that it can be, and it can better serve mobilizing finance. And the 100 billion annual goal must be reached. I'm absolutely sure about that. And it needs to be accessible. The coalition, this finance ministers' coalition, it is not negotiating about that yet on these kind of issues. But we could play a role and also contribute in many ways. So I think this coalition is also important in talking about this topic. And briefly, I would like to make three small points. First, the coalition, we already have 67 countries in. That's a good number, 67 countries. And they represent different levels of development, climate challenge and geographic backgrounds. In the coalition, we work together. We work together and we learn from each other, and we try to understand the policy challenges and help each other, of course. And second, we finance ministers, we are acting as governors in many international financial institutions. And also those institutions are part of that coalition. We can meet and discuss there with the financial institutions, and we ourselves, we have a role on those institutions. It is important that the complex ecosystem of multilateral financial organizations works efficiently, and that we know each other's tools and that we have the same targets. This means that the many is used efficiently and leads to maximum climate impact. And thirdly, about the coalition. Coalition is about mainstreaming climate into economic policies. Why is this important? It is important because careful economic and financial planning leads to transparency, finance stability, and better creditworthiness. Investors and donors value this, and they also need transparency about where the money is flowing. So I think we need to go deeper to the incentives. Which are the incentives? Have more country-focused approaches and also ensure that our financial systems work efficiently to mobilize climate finance. This way, I think we could achieve more with the existing resources. And somehow the symbol of this meaning of this coalition is that we started 2.5 years ago, and now there are 67 countries in. Everybody has realized that finance and combating against climate change, that's a combination. You need the financial tools and the financial investors, the banks, they are also very important cooperations, partners with us.
Thank you so much, Annika. And we were expecting also Nigel Clark, the minister from Jamaica, as we are missing him still. I just looked to the moderator. Where's the moderator? Whether I've got the permission to just have one quick round for additional round. Okay, so I got it. I take it that I got it. If you would give the conference here when discussing about the finance in future, a piece of advice, one thing we should focus on specifically to get the finance scale up easier and more effective. Is there one single issue you would underscore? Yeah, just Annika, start.
Unfortunately, my schedule is so tight that I have to go soon, so I'll raise my hand. But I want one point to mention. In this field, what comes to finance and climate change, we need more facts. We have to analyze the facts, and we have to find the real numbers. What kind of problems climate change is causing, and what are the costs of them? So we have to know the number, what we are losing, also in the financial way, if we are not facing this problem in a serious way. So if you are just talking about investments and also the threats, but you don't know how much it costs, those awful phenomena what climate change is causing, then the real change won't happen. So we need analyzing, more research, more facts, and concrete numbers. So we need, and that's the question also in the developing countries, but also in those countries where the system is getting even in a forerunner way.
Yes, and I know that on a later podium, Lord Stern, our good friend Nick, I think he's the best one to report on the cost of inaction with his groundbreaking report and his later research work. Why not just go in this direction, Yannick?
Minister, you have been mentioning the need to reach $100 billion, and this is critical. But the composition of this $100 billion is also critical. It's not only $100 billion, it's what kind of form and what kind of instruments. Because $100 billion is only a fraction of the money we need in order to foster a paradigm shift toward low-emission, climate-resilient development in developing countries. It's between $1 to $4 trillion a year that will have to be catalyzed. And for that, we need to have this $100 billion in as a flexible manner as possible. When you have grant, you can convert grant into anything. Grant for policy development, but you can convert it into extension of tenure for commercial loans. You can convert it into guarantees. You can convert it into equities. When your form of finance is basically limited to one instrument, your capacity to use this money in a highly catalytic manner is dramatically diminished. So the form of finance is extremely important. And after, in addition to the financing gap, it's important to speak about the adaptation gap. And it's important to make sure that this form of finance will be also appropriate for adaptation. So both the amount, but also the composition, because it's a much larger amount that we have to shift.
So is this the final remark?
Yeah, I'm not, let me support what he says about the whole issue of the $100 billion not being the magic thing. Look, we need $1 to $2 trillion a year for 30 years to be able to save our planet. So the $100 billion is not, we shouldn't be looking at it as if we solve all our problems. It would not. But it is a minimum, that is the floor we should have as to build trust as we deal collectively with this issue. But what I just want to say is, what we measure, it's very important in terms of wealth, right? You take a look at our world today, we measure wealth in terms of GDP. Well, who said GDP is what we should be doing? GDP is your value of your goods and services that you add to an economy. It does not say anything about the technology, the process, the positive and negative externalities that it generates. So I think if you're really serious about really shifting incentives, we have to be more systemic. We've got to remeasure wealth. Wealth is not measured in terms of you cannot be rewarding people for damaging the environment. You want to be penalizing them for damaging the environment. So in my view, the only thing I want to say is that I think we need to really look at this very, very seriously and weight GDP downwards for negative externalities and the destruction they cause versus those that are actually also improving things for the environment. You want to give them a notch in there. So there's a lot of work, analytical work we need to do there. Let's make sure that we are measuring our wealth without destroying our environment and our biosphere.
I think I couldn't agree more and would love to talk a long time, much more than we have, on how to measure welfare and how to organize the trillions we need.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to quickly jump and explain why we have a movable feast or hot seating or hot desking in terms of our panelists. These discussions are happening around us are genuine and essentially in action. So we have now been joined by the Honourable Nigel Clark, who's going to say a few words as well in terms of his perspective as Minister of Finance from Jamaica. And Alok Sharma, the President of COP, is going to address us towards the end of the events today rather than now. So, Nigel Clark.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am coming from another panel discussion which overlapped with this and was just completed. You know, the challenge of financing or preparing financing that countries can access for the climate change agenda is a huge one, but one that's not insurmountable. I want to just speak from the perspective of Jamaica and from the disaster risk financing perspective. We don't have the luxury of waiting for all the adaptation financing to be assembled before we start to get going, because the risks are here and they materialize on an annual basis throughout our region. Every year, we have tropical cyclones and hurricanes that hit the news, and it's a matter of roll of the dice as to whether your country will be directly hit or not. And as a result, it is absolutely necessary to have a menu of financial instruments that can pay out in the event of natural disaster. And this aspect of financing is one that probably needs to get as much attention as the adaptation and mitigation. Jamaica, from the perspective of a small island state, pioneered or is the first country in the world to issue independently a catastrophe bond, which we successfully placed last July in international capital markets with the technical assistance of the World Bank and the bilateral support of the UK, Germany, and the United States, who helped with the premium payments. And this catastrophe bond pays out to Jamaica in the event of tropical cyclones that surpass certain pre-agreed thresholds that can be observed by anyone. Just has to do with the centralized air pressure of hurricanes. We found that when we went to market with this, and we marketed this instrument to international capital markets, to insurance and reinsurance investors, to asset managers, and to hedge funds, there's great interest as it's a risk that's uncorrelated with equity markets and commodity markets and debt capital markets, and offered a new kind of exposure for which investors were reasonably compensated. And what Jamaica gets out of it is that in the event of a storm that hits those thresholds, we get a payout that can assist with emergency financing needs. And our vision is that this aspect of financing for the climate change agenda for countries who are already exposed, and that exposure, whether you hit 1.5 degrees or not, that exposure is already there and it will be there indefinitely. Our vision is to institutionalize this kind of a priori financing. Isn't it better to arrange the financing ex ante before an event rather than to have donor conferences after the event where people are pledging to provide support? And we have a vision of having this be done on a Caribbean-wide scale and with greater participation at higher levels of coverage. Now, this instrument doesn't stand on its own. We're pursuing a multi-layered approach, with the catastrophe bond being the final layer, but other layers, annual budget provisions, a natural disaster fund to which we welcome contributions, as well as credit contingent claims and parametric insurance. So a menu of fiscal facilities that we are putting in place to ensure that we are prepared. Now, I'll just say a word on the adaptation, raising money for adaptation. The infrastructure requirements to prepare our economies to be decarbonized, and admittedly, we're not one of the main producers there, but certainly to prepare our economies for the effect of climate change, the resources required are huge, and they outstrip the capacity of the public purse. And countries in our region will need to be able to access international capital markets and private sector investments. And we believe that preparing the regulatory and other environments to ensure that our projects can be attractive to international capital is very important. And that's where we are spending resources and spending time to ensure that we can access capital using PPP frameworks and other frameworks, and investors can find a way to earn a reasonable return while ensuring that Jamaica and countries like Jamaica have the investment that we need to adapt to the changing environment.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And that is a fantastic note, or fantastic transition, from this panel, which was really looking at how to realize the $100 billion goal for developing country support, which I must say I'm not sure has been realized, but it's a transition from that into the next panel, which is about supporting a financial system for net zero and a resilient future. Because, of course, one of the messages from this morning is that although the $100 billion goal has not been realized, that is just a drop in the bucket compared to the $100 trillion financing needs for climate change and the 130 trillion finance which Mark Carney's group appears to have raised from the financial sector to support the net zero transition. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Chair Jochen Flassberg, for your flexibility and adaptability as the panelists came in and out. And I'd now like to call up the next panel, which is going to be moderated by Chancellor of the UK, Rishi Sunak. And I'd like to also call up Carlos Dominguez, who's the Secretary of Finance for Climate Change Commission in the Philippines. Also, Minister Arbaleche, who's the Minister of Economy and Finance of Uruguay. Alison Rose, who's the Chief Executive of NatWest Group, and Matthias Kormann, who's the Secretary General of the OECD, to talk under the Chancellor's guidance about how to support a financial system for net zero and a resilient future. So, Chancellor Sunak, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Right. I think. Come and have a seat. Should we go from this end? Alison, Matthias, you want to come down here? Right. Come and have a seat.
Alison Rose, hello. How do you
Matthias, hi. Alison, hi.
Hi, how are you, Matthias?
Ah. How are you, Ms. Rabelece? Welcome.
Thank you.
Come and have a seat.
Hello, how are you? How are you? Hello.
Great. Well, let's get going. Thanks very much to my fantastic panelists for joining me, and thanks to State Secretary Jochen for chairing such a dynamic panel previously on supporting developing countries and what more we need to do to reach the $100 billion goal sooner. But we know that public investment is not enough. We need to mobilize the power of private finance. The Paris Agreement was explicit on this point. All financial flows must become aligned with the climate targets that we signed up to. And today in Glasgow, we are delivering on that commitment. So what is our vision for transforming the financial system? Well, obviously, it's a financial system that needs to support our climate goals, support jobs, support innovation, and get finance to those who need it the most. I think the good news is, and very optimistically across the panel today, it's clear that we're making progress towards that vision. I'm glad to say the UK is doing its bit to play its part. We became the first country in the world last year to mandate climate disclosures on the TCFD guidelines. Today we announced we will become the first country in the world to have a net zero aligned financial centre, moving towards mandatory publication of transition plans. We're also embedding net zero in our financial regulation through our regulators, which is also a positive step. But on the international stage, we're also seeing terrific progress. Just earlier today, the IFRS launched its International Sustainability Standards Board, which will create some baseline standards for all of us to look at. That's now being backed by over 35 countries. The Network for Greening the Financial System now covers 80% of global emissions, and within that we have central banks covering half of global emissions, carrying out climate-related stress tests. And of course, thanks to the leadership of Mark Carney and others, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero now represents over $130 trillion of global finance, 450 firms, all aligned with net zero. What all that means is investors can now easily identify and invest in green projects. We can manage the risks of climate change, and we can seize the opportunities of transition. Because my simple goal is that the message we want coming out loud and clear from Glasgow is that whatever climate ambitions we set over the next couple of weeks, the finance is there to deliver them. And with that, I was going to start turning it over to my fellow panelists, and maybe I could ask you all a kind of set of questions to get your thoughts on. I mean, one, broadly, what are your thoughts on the progress that we are making in developing a financial system that can support net zero and a climate resilient future? But also, what steps should finance ministers in particular be taking to make sure that we maintain this progress and deliver sustainable growth for developing countries? So maybe, Carlos, can I start with you?
Sure. Well, thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today. Finance plays an indispensable role in making climate adaptation and mitigations projects possible to implement on the ground. It dictates the pace and the scale of the transition towards achieving our climate ambition. It is important that we have a clear definition of what constitutes climate finance. Climate finance, I believe, should aspire for a sustainable orchestration of three elements: of grants, investments, and subsidies. Grants should be used to improve the capacity of local communities in climate-vulnerable areas to undertake the mitigation and adaptation measures. These grants should come in the form of education or technical assistance programs to help the people conceive and execute localized projects. Investment should focus on programs and projects that actually yield returns. For instance, investments in solar power will unlock more business opportunities, create new jobs, and lead to energy self-reliance in the long run. Subsidies are meant to support initiatives leading to the transition to a climate-resilient economy. These should address the financial costs and risks of such adjustments. For instance, we need to provide financial aid to communities during the transition period when they start to gradually shift to renewable energy sources, replacing power plants that use fossil fuels. This blended approach should be at the heart of climate finance. Given such funds come from investors and taxpayers, accountability and transparency must be ensured. Beneficiary countries need to constantly assure their donors and taxpayers and investors that their money is being used properly. The Philippines is firm in its position that those who have emitted and continue to emit the most greenhouse gases must bear the largest financial burden in this transition to carbon neutrality. The Philippines, however, will not wait for Western nations to get their act together. Climate change is here. It's happening. We are moving ahead with the implementation of actual projects on the ground to enable us to meet our commitments. We introduced our own sustainable financial roadmap with the help of the UK to mobilize public and private investments in green projects. We are ready to initiate a landmark project with the Asian Development Bank that will accelerate the country's transition to clean energy. We have collected our best scientists all over the Philippines to prepare and to help execute localized programs. The Philippines is determined to move ahead, even as other countries hesitate to meet their commitments. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much for that. Maybe next, if we go to Minister Allocation.
Sure. Thank you, Chancellor, for being in this panel today. And let's first address your question about have we done progress lately? And I think that certainly the answer is we have. In the case of Uruguay, it's the first time that we do have in the budget law articles that mainstream climate action into economic policy. The central bank, on the other side, it's part of the green financial system networking, and at the same time, it has a mandate to invest in certain assets that are linked to environment. So I think that surely we have done a lot of progress. In the previous panel, where we just came running from, I think it was the comment by Treasurer Yellen that it was the first time that the US Treasurer assisted to a COP. I think that that shows that we are in a point of inflection, I would say. It's an historical time where ministers of finance in general has a very important role to play if we really want to make progress and see results. And that is where we have to go. I think that in order to make progress, and if we want to move from pledges, from words, into concrete action, into results, it's very important to align the different incentives that we all have. Investors have their incentives, the financial institutions have their incentives, the sovereigns, we have certain incentives. But I think it's putting everything together, aligning the different objectives that we have that can deliver concrete actions. In the case of Uruguay, we have key performance indicators that are related to the NDCs, that are part of the Paris Agreement, and we're working specifically on the implementation of an instrument, a financial instrument, a bond where the cost of borrowing is related to this NDC goal. So we can be rewarded or we can be punished according to our behavior in terms of environment. So I think it's important. Countries, we do have NDCs. Investors, they don't have NDCs. But if investors really are interested in environment, then they should be willing to put their money into this kind of instruments. So it's the alignment of these different incentives that will make progress and give us concrete results. And I'm sure that it's a time where we can put forward innovative financial instruments. I spoke about a bond. It could be loans from private sectors that are linked to certain environmental indicators, well known, that can be tracked, that can be measured. So I think that the money is there, their interest is there. We just have to link everything so that we can have concrete results.
Okay. That's very interesting. We should come back to that in our discussion at the end about these new financial instruments. Maybe Alison, if I go to you next.
Thank you, Chancellor. Thank you for having me here today to take part in Finance Day, which I think is absolutely critical and a critical moment in a crucial fortnight. It's clearly important that governments and central banks are working together to set the direction and maintain our course as we head towards the net zero carbon future. But I think we're all very clear on the imperative to get there quickly. And the thing that will dictate most our speed is finance. So if the money isn't there, then it won't be there to fund the infrastructure projects or the scale up of new technologies that we need, or the new innovative forms of financing which are going to be so critical in order to achieve our goals. So that's why, as the representative of the private sector on the stage today, I want to say how much it has helped that governments are committing very clearly and very quickly to targets and the focus on net zero. I think transparency, clear direction of travel and policy are going to be critical. This will give investors, finance providers, shareholders, insurance companies and banks the confidence and certainty that they need in order to invest their time, their energy and the financing in the low carbon projects that will deliver our targets. And that's what's galvanized the level of activity we're seeing in the private sector at the moment. And it is an activity that has been sorely needed because we know how much change is required. Chancellor, you mentioned the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, of which NatWest is a founding member. And this represents a concerted effort from more than 295 financial organizations in 40 different countries to see that the required capital is mobilized on the ground, committing to $130 trillion to hit net zero target emissions by 2050. Very bluntly, the money is here and the money is committed and the money is starting to mobilize. And I think this is a very significant demonstration of the collaboration with so many different financial organizations who so often are competing but are now working together and united behind a common goal. But our ask is, in order to mobilize and deploy this capital more rapidly, is that governments around the world put in place policies that confirm the direction of travel, that encourage businesses and customers who are the ones who must deliver this transition, give them the confidence those investments are going to be able to be made, that the governments establish clear, practical steps to cut emissions and clearly agree who is expected to deliver what, and that governments and regulators around the world work together to ensure that there are incentives and frameworks for going green in every part of the globe, and that we close the gap between this green premium. There are lots of examples where public and private sector working together are incredibly effective. We've seen that with the solar farms in Africa that have delivered substantial change in alignment of public and private financing. The Costa Rican government, for example, has just won the Earthshot Prize for their work to incentivize reforestation, doubling the size of Costa Rica's forests and contributing $4 billion to the economy. And I hope that we can see more actions like that where we can mobilize the finance. And we know that that looks different in different parts of the world, where some of us to get the focus on improving our impact, and for others it's about doing all that can be done to improve resilience and adapt to climate events. But that is why we need to work together, and I reiterate, the private sector is at the table with the financing and committed to drive this change. But we must make sure it is a transition for all. As a leading UK bank, we're helping businesses like those at our stalls in the green zone and families to manage their financing and put in their hands practical steps to help them make the transition and give them the confidence. We've recently committed £100 billion to fund and finance climate transition in the UK for small and medium-sized businesses who will represent 30% of the emissions of the UK. And it is initiatives like that multiplied globally that will allow us to do this. We need to make sure that the money is going to the right places. We need to make sure the incentives are there to deliver them, and we need public and private sector to work closely together to ensure the mobilization can accelerate. The fact that I'm sharing the stage today with my fellow panelists, that the private sector is here, is, I think, a great step forward and shows the collaborative approach is the cornerstone of COP26. So I think my ask would be to say the challenge is we have to be bold, we have to be ambitious. I think there are very clear signals coming out of COP around transparency, the direction of travel, where we need to go, tougher targets, real commitments, so that we can deliver the change that's desperately needed and that we can't afford to wait.
Alison, thank you very much indeed. Matthias.
Thank you, Rishi, and let me just first, right up front, support the key message out of the first panel, and that is how important it is to reach the $100 billion US a year climate finance provided and mobilized by developed economies for developing countries as soon as possible. And let me also confirm that based on current commitments, the OECD has assessed that this objective should be reached and exceeded from 2023 onwards. And let me also confirm the key point that you made, and that is to be able to get to net zero, we need to make all finance flows kick in that same direction. And that is not really happening just yet. So to go to your question about what finance ministers should be looking at, well, governments should be removing those distortions that divert investment away from the transition to net zero. And too many policies still encourage emissions-intensive investment, production and consumption. I mean, despite a commitment by the G20 since 2009 to gradually move away from inefficient fuel subsidies, ongoing annual support for fossil fuels and environmentally harmful agricultural subsidies as well, to the tune of many hundreds of billions of dollars, surpassed all the one-off green recovery spending in just a few years. And of the total recovery spending announced to date across OECD, EU and partner countries, about 10% has been identified by the OECD as having a mixed or even a negative impact on the environment. And really, in terms of looking at finance flows, kicking goals in that direction towards net zero by 2050, that's really something that we've got to continue to look at. Let me highlight one bright spot on this front, though. The OECD's Development Assistance Committee, in the lead up to COP26, has announced that it will fully align official development assistance with the goals of the Paris Agreement on climate change. And to put that into perspective, in 2020, official development assistance through ODI donor countries came in at the tune of $161 billion US. So that is a sizable amount of aid that, as of COP, will now be fully aligned to the objectives of the Paris Agreement. In terms of the second area, we need that thorough transformation of the financial system to better incorporate long-term climate risks and opportunities, as has been talked about widely here at COP26. Around $40 trillion US in assets are subject to some form of environmental, social and governance assessment. Yet scores across major ESG ratings providers lack consistency or links with environmental outcomes. Portfolios could score well on environment metrics despite having a high carbon footprint, for example. At the OECD, we will advance a policy framework to better integrate ESG factors that support the net zero transition. Finally, we need to find ways to better support the transition in emissions-intensive sectors. I mean, those are sectors with insufficient access to finance to get on to that transition pathway, particularly in emerging economies and developing countries. So our report on transition finance finds that there is a serious lack of consistency in the guidance and taxonomies for transition finance. Convergence and clarity is needed to help build markets for transition finance while avoiding market fragmentation and greenwashing. That is why we will develop OECD high-level principles on transition finance in close consultation and collaboration with the right range of stakeholders. These are just some thoughts.
Okay. Matthias, thank you. Now, we've got a few minutes left, so I was going to maybe pick up on something that a couple of you mentioned, and I was going to ask Minister Arbeleche and Minister Dominguez to respond. You heard from Alison about the $130 trillion of private finance that's signed up to the GFANZ commitment that can be deployed over time to support countries like yours with the transition. You heard from Matthias and me about the things that we're trying to do to rewire the global financial system to enable those funds to flow to the right place. From your perspective, what would you say needs to happen, or what are the barriers that you see that need to be unblocked to make sure that that money, which sounds great and it's there on a piece of paper, actually finds its way to practical, tangible projects in your countries that will make a difference to people's lives and actually help you? And if you sit there today and say, well, look, that sounds great, but these things need to change for that to be a reality, what are the types of things that you would say to us that we need to go away and make sure that we fix? Because it's all very well having the money, the amount sitting on a piece of paper. We need to make sure it actually gets to the things it needs to get to.
I think that the role of the multilateral agencies are very crucial in this part. The multilateral agencies actually are agents of governments, right? All of us as ministers sit as governors in ADB or World Bank or the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It is very important that these multilateral agencies actually begin the projects. That will allow the private sector, I believe, and give them confidence that these projects have been studied very well, have been vetted by the multilateral agencies, and will, I think, open the doors for funds from the private sector to flow into actual projects on the ground.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's very helpful. We actually had a session on that earlier.
Yes.
And I very much echo what you say. We need our MDBs to do more, to be ambitious. They've made a great start with the declaration today, but obviously we need to flesh that out. And to your point, that can help leverage in private capital if they can provide that reassurance to private investors. So that's a helpful thing for us to focus on. Minister Arbeleche.
Thank you, Chancellor. I think that what we need is, as I've been saying many times today, is to walk the talk. We really need to deliver. And in that sense, I agree with my colleague, we have to be innovative, we have to be creative. The instrument that, by we, I mean everybody. I mean banks, private banks, multilaterals, sovereigns, issuers, we all have to be creative. I think that the private sector and the corporates, they have already issued green bonds, and they have already issued bonds that are linked to certain indicators. In that case, what we've seen is that if the coupon, the interest payment, can be higher if the company is punished because it doesn't fulfill its commitment. What we are starting right now in Uruguay is to have both a step up or step down coupon, so that we are rewarded or we are penalized according to our environmental behavior. So this kind of innovative instrument, I think that the private sector can also think of this. Banks, the financial system can think of this. So I think that we'd have to think out of the box. As we said before, the money is there. we really want to mitigate and to adapt to climate change, so we have to meet the different areas with innovation and creativity. Last 2 weeks ago, during the IMF and World Bank meetings, we had different meetings with the multilaterals, but also with donors, with private sector, and there is appetite for this kind of instruments. So I think that those that are experts have to sit down and to think for how to join these different ends.
I mean, to that point, Minister, I was maybe going to ask Matthias and Alison. Matthias, from where you sit, are you seeing innovation and creativity around how we finance the transition, the structuring of new products, new instruments, new types of bonds? Is there any advice you can provide, or things that you think we will need to adjust and adapt to make this work, along the Minister's points about a new type of bond with a coupon that fluctuates depending on performance?
I mean, I think that certainly the world is really focused on getting this right, and we've got the best and brightest minds really thinking through carefully on how this can be done with the appropriate levels of integrity to really achieve the mission. I mean, I think that there is a lot of work to be done to ensure that, you know, some of the early good intentions that were probably not structured in the best possible way are properly tidied up, and I think it is important to get the definitions and some of those standards right. So there is a real role for regulatory and policy guidance and rigor. But I think, I mean, you know, I think overwhelmingly people are focused on getting this done, and I think we will get it done.
Okay, good. Alison, any last thought? Because you mentioned actually integrity before, about having clear information for businesses like yours to make decisions that you can trust the information.
Yeah, I think giving people confidence, I mean, having a common taxonomy, clear transparency in terms of transition paths, so that people can align with that both on the finance side and the borrower side is really critical, because I think, you know, there is a lot of terminology around, and what we need to give is integrity and clarity and direction of travel. And I think what that will do is actually allow the money to flow faster. I agree with you. There are good signs and good indications. I think there are some great things we can do with the multilaterals that will very quickly allow the money to flow. But that, you know, policy direction, common terminology, clear alignment between borrower and lender across multiple dimensions will mean the money will be deployed, because there is real commitment to meet this and fund the transition.
Very, very clear message, and we are over time. So thank you all for your fantastic contributions. I think we know what we have to do, that you paint an optimistic but realistic vision of what's possible for us, and we now need to get to work. So please, could you join me in thanking our fantastic panelists?
Well, thank you very much indeed. And we now move to the third panel of this part of the proceedings, which is the panel to discuss scaling climate finance to mobilize the trillions needed in developing countries. In other words, how do we take the type of initiatives we've just been hearing about to unleash some of the money in the world's financial system and get it into the right places in an effective manner? And we have, the panel's going to be chaired by Lord Stern, Professor Lord Stern, who's been one of the luminaries and one of the great public intellectuals driving forward the climate debate, along with Sri Mulyani Indrawati, Minister of Finance of Indonesia, who's already spoken forcefully several times today and laid down a challenge for the world's leaders. And of course, Indonesia, the country that she's finance minister of, will be chairing the G20 soon. Makta Diop, who's Managing Director and Executive Vice President of the IFC, and Rémi Réau, who's CEO of the French Development Agency and Chairman of the International Development Finance Club and President of Finance in the Common Summit. So, over to you, Lord Stern.
Thank you, Gillian. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. This follows in the same spirit, but with a different question from the previous panels. Our question's about scaling up. How do we find the support for the private finance, its interrelationship with public finance, in order to bring the finance that is commensurate with what we have to do? And we've heard many descriptions, but it is in the trillions. In the emerging market and developing countries, by 2030, the flow probably has to be in the order of 2 trillion a year for new investments. You can tell the story different ways, get slightly different numbers, but that's the order of magnitude of what is necessary in emerging markets and developing countries. So we'll be talking about scaling up the private finance, but also at the same time scaling up the public finance in a way that supports that expansion of private finance. They've given me 3 minutes at the beginning, and I'm going to use it to set out some ideas which we'll publish later tonight on our website at the London School of Economics on a post-2025 framework for scaling up. Essentially unpacking what was put together in the 100 billion and asking how you move the different bits of that. First and foremost, we must deliver the 100 billion without moving the goalposts, and we must do it, if possible, next year, but absolutely no later than the year after. That's a basic question of trust. A word was given, it has to be delivered. But now is the time to move beyond that and ask how we can move upwards from there and how we can look at the different components. We will suggest that there should be 5 different components. That could make up that story of the public flows, the international public flows that could support this change. The first one would be the bilateral commitments, which we think should be around $60 billion a year by 2025. The next one is the support for the concessional funds, the special funds, which are managed by international institutions, such as the Green Climate Fund, which was here before, and the Global Environmental Facility. The third one is the expansion of the multilateral development banks and what they can bring to the table. Remy will be talking also about the development finance institutions, and that, we argue, from multilateral development banks should go up to around 90 billion a year by 2025. So those are 3 key sources. The fourth is the private sector, which is directly mobilized by these funds. At the moment, most of the institutions that we're talking about here, they hover around 50 cents private mobilized for every dollar. Way below $1, way below 1 for 1. That has to be organized in a way that is really ramped up, that those multipliers are ramped up in a very substantial way. And the fifth strand is what we might call innovative finance. The special drawing rights of the IMF, the voluntary carbon markets, the philanthropies now who, bless them, are moving strongly into this whole area. If we put those 5 components together in a creative, strong way, we as a world working together, then we could really start to mobilize the many hundreds of billions through these processes that would support and drive the trillions of dollars of investment finance that are necessary. Some, of course, would come from domestic resource mobilization from the public sector in the countries concerned. Of course it would. Some would come from the domestic private sector. The South Africa, Indonesia, India, many examples where the private sector is very eager to move, but it has to have the right framework and the right kind of support and risk management so that these public funds can give. So that's a story we must now, here at COP26, talk about the post-2025 framework, and it's a scaling up framework, and it is looking at the way in the different parts of the system can fit together, and this panel is absolutely perfectly placed to have that discussion. They will all be part of it in their own ways. So, Sri Mulyani, it's been a pleasure to work with you for so long. Great admiration for what you've been doing, what you will do as the head of the G20, what you've begun to do as the co-chair of the Coalition of Finance Ministers on Climate, and what you do all day, every day in your job as Finance Minister of Indonesia. Over to you, Sri Mulyani.
Well, thank you so much, Nick. It's really a pleasure to be in this panel, and especially talking about how we are going to mobilize funding, which is first part, as you mentioned, Nick, is already being pledged during the Poland COP24 meeting, 100 billion, which is not delivered. I think the most recent report by the biennial assessment is only around 48.7 billion, right? So this is going to be something that need to be still accountable. The accountability of this 100 billion will continue, very important. You mentioned earlier that this need to be delivered 2022, 2023. That is only like 2 years from now. As a finance minister, we usually knows very clear. If you are talking about 2022, you already discussed it in 2021. So if today we are not going to discuss about how to fill the gap of this 100 billion, then you are not going to be there. And this is exactly maybe the credibility issue need to be addressed. Because on the one hand, this is not delivered. On the other hand, many developing and emerging countries have to deal with the implication of this climate change. So they definitely need more funding for the adaptation as well as the mitigation. Now, for Indonesia, we also already pledged our own within the Paris Agreement. 41% if there will be support from the international community. So we updated our nationally determined contribution in this year, 2021. We also submitted long-term strategy for low carbon and climate resilience 2050, in which Indonesia is going to reach the net zero emission in 2060 or in this case earlier. Our current estimation to achieve the NDZ is around 270 billion, which is I already mentioned many times in the different panel since this morning. And of this 270 billion, our own budget will actually, and this is not yet net zero emission target, this is the NDC, Nick. So if you are going to get the NDC, net zero emission, by 2060 or earlier, that figure will definitely much larger than 270 billion. Now, our own budget provided only 21% of this need of the NDC. So definitely the role of additional support financing is going to be very critical. You've already mentioned earlier, Nick, in this case, the role of many sources of funding that could and should be mobilized. Indonesia, in this case, have the view that long-term finance work program must be continued beyond 2020. I think we need to discuss about this 100 billion. While you are talking about these 5 elements to complement this 100 billion, which I also agree in this case that while this is still need to be discussed and addressed of this gap of 100 billion, then we talk about the 5 additionality that you are talking about. And this is exactly what the Indonesia also doing. We put policy and regulatory framework, including our own instrument on our fiscal, so that we are going to be able to maximize or use this source of financing which you mentioned earlier, whether this is from the grant, like Green Fund, or this is coming from the Multilateral Development Bank, which we discussed, whether through the country partnership program, we have the energy transmission mechanism that we initiated with ADB in this case. We also discussing about how we are going to de-risk and also providing more role of private sector by designing the catalytic instrument. We are not only rely on the MDB. Within our own domestic policy framework, we've already established a special mission vehicle, we call it, under the Ministry of Finance. Like we have PTSMI, I have the IIF and PII. These are all special mission vehicle. Some of them jointly owned by Multilateral Development Bank. And their role is really try to establish what is being asked by, if you want to have private sector to participate, they usually ask, where is the project, right? And project preparation, I work in the World Bank with Mahtar, and we know very well. You can talk about so many renewable projects or any project with the climate change, but they are not there yet. So the preparation for the project is very important. That's why we have Project Development Fund, which is being created by the Ministry of Finance through this special mission vehicle. We can work together with MDB and other in order for us to be able to develop and preparing this green project. Because if Indonesia, for example, have to retire coal earlier, we have to not only replace the energy from the coal, but also to continue building the energy which is coming from renewable. So this will require huge renewable energy project. And Project Development Fund is going to be very critical. We also, within the Ministry of Finance, introduced VGF, Viability Gap Fund. Because sometimes when you have the project, they are requiring a high rate of return, both because of huge capital spending as well as the rate of return that is expected, while the affordability of the industry or the people to buy those electricity is much less. So you really have to feel that. VGF also created by us. Government even also providing guarantee in order for us to, again, creating this catalytic role. So what I'm saying is that for Indonesia, we establish all this regulatory framework, institution, and instrument in order for us to be able to exactly what you just mentioned earlier, Nick, to link this pool of fund from the private sector, especially also the global fund, which is huge, 130 trillion, that they are willing and able to come to Indonesia. We also issue green bonds, and this is I've already mentioned many times about the green bond. While the compliance cost for issuing green bond is very rigorous and of course costly, the premium is not reflecting the benefit of issuing this one. So that definitely need to be fixed or to be corrected. So what I'm saying is that while we are talking about this 100 billion which is not delivered, accountability of this 100 by the advanced country need to be continued and delivered in the next 2 years. At the same time, emerging and developing countries could and should develop policy framework, regulatory framework, including developing their own instrument of financing in order for us to be able to benefit or to get this potential pool of funds globally. If this can be done together, I think we are going to be able to at least have the optimism to get both NDC as well as the net zero emission. At the Ministry of Finance, we also currently developing climate change fiscal framework. This is in order for us to be able to make sure the credibility of our budget, first in terms of commitment to the climate change or green project, and the second one, to be able to track in a more transparent and credible way in terms of our delivery. So this is going to be one of the most important. So that is maybe the most important. Be accountable, be credible, be coherent, and then you are discussing about this climate change commitment in a more concrete and real way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sri Mulyani. Creating the conditions for investment, drawing the investment through is part of the whole story of bringing the finance to support that investment. Makta, that's what you do all day, every day. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and it's a pleasure to be with Sri Mulyani and Remy. I am very optimistic for this COP26 because all of us were in Paris at the COP21. And if you remember, government were talking separately from philanthropy, from private sector. And DFI were not necessarily talking to each other. Fast forward today, Remy has been doing a great job to putting all DFI together to talk together about what we can do. Private sector is talking very much with the public sector. And as this morning, I was in a panel, philanthropy, I was saying that, how can we have the greatest effect? Is it just to put our resources that we have or try to leverage it? So what I'm hearing in this COP26 is a leveraging, catalytic, and working together in partnership. And I think that this is what will be the finance of today if we want to be able to reach these resources. So what I'm seeing as being the challenges that we are facing. First, we need to work on the regulatory framework. Shrimulani said it very well. Let me give you a number. 200 framework today to monitor the green financing across 40 countries. So private investor is very costly to think about all these monitoring, these frameworks, these requirements. So let's try to standardize all this. Standardize it will be reducing the cost of doing business. Second, PPP is important, but for PPP, we need to have a flow of project. Project preparation is very, very important, and we need, as much as we try to mobilize additional resources, to strengthen the capacity of government to really have these. But also to think about not only the capacity from the DFI or the partners to help countries, but the countries themselves to be able to have a program which is a long-term program. So this is a second element. The third element that I think which is very important is to expand the pipeline and find platform. How do we want to expand the pipeline? Is by reducing the cost of development for project. It's very expensive in a lot of emerging economies, and for that to develop platform. For instance, we developed the platform on scale in solar, which allowed to significantly reduce the cost of new technology, which was not mainstream at the beginning of this decade. I remember in 2012, when Shrimulani and I were looking at it at the World Bank, we were talking about 22 cents in PV solar. 5 years later, it was 2 cents. And that, it was simplifying the process, simplifying the technology access. The last point is innovation. Innovation, and I would like to take the opportunity to announce that IFC is putting a package of $5 billion, which will be $3 billion on a platform on loan, will be allowing us to finance activity which has 100% aligned to Paris, and a bond of $2 billion that will allow over 5 years to mobilize $13 billion. How did we do that? Is that exactly what the point you made earlier, which is banded finance and de-risking. De-risking, de-risking, de-risking. By de-risking this bond, we are able, with Amundi, who is the manager of this bond, to be able to bring bonds which are not investment grade to investment grade, and therefore make it accessible to institutional investors, to pension funds, to be able to invest in this bond and be able to have the effect that we would like to have. So I think that we have a momentum now. We need to work on all these fronts to accelerate the implementation, and more importantly, to syndicate all our effort. Lastly, what we're trying to do now is to bring the philanthropy world in de-risking investment. And we have launched a first initiative with Raj Shah recently, which allows on energy to do that. But we want to expand that approach to all sectors to be able to have that momentum with the synergy with DFI, with government, and with philanthropy.
Thank you so much, Magda. It's a very rich story, but two key elements in that is that we've got to bring down the cost of capital and increase the flow, do both those things together. And simplification and scale is a key part of that story, and fundamentally managing, reducing, sharing risk. Two absolutely key elements in upping the flow and bringing down the cost of capital is absolutely vital. And Rémi, this is what you do. Of course, Agence France de Développement is absolute key development agency, but also your work in the International Development Finance Club has been admired by so many for what it is doing, and I'm sure you'll tell us about what it will be doing. So over to you, Rémi.
No, thank you, Nick, Minister Maktar. Yes, we were all in this room at COP21 in Paris. I remember it vividly, but now it's COP26, and it's the COP of delivery. And so let me focus on that in my two capacities as the CEO of AFD and as the chairman of the IDFC. AFD delivered alignment. In 2017, we decided as an institution to be 100% Paris aligned. It means to us, first, support the alignment of the demand side. And we are extremely happy at this COP to see what the Republic of South Africa, what Vietnam, what Colombia, what Indonesia, many others came to declare. And in these countries, all our institutions try to support and have the macroeconomic models, the research to help these commitments. We will do the same with financial intermediaries, all willing parties. And then, of course, we have to align the supply side. I mean, meaning aligning our own institution. So now at AFD, the methodology is in place. We are even proposing it to the market when we are issuing climate or sustainable bonds, and we want to be more selective and focus on the accelerating of existing renewable technologies. And so I announced today that we just revised our energy policy to exit from all fossil, including natural gas at AFD. It's not to exclude, it's just to focus our strengths, our financial investments towards renewable. Since COP21, we provided more than $30 billion climate finance, $7 billion this year as part of the 100 billion pledge, which is, as you know, more than what France pledged at COP21. And I want also to insist on another commitment, which is to link climate finance with biodiversity finance. So we pledge that 30% of our climate finance will be nature positive by 2025. It's better than to have two different targets because it's one and single issue that we have to tackle. Is a close friend and an institution of high quality, and of course working with multilaterals. What we have accomplished since COP21, we provided $1 trillion from 2015 as a group of 26 institutions. We are discussing right now, we have our annual meetings tomorrow, of increasing the ambition. We think we have the potential to increase it by a third, so up to $1.3 trillion between 2019 and 2025. We are also, of course, in the working on the implementation of the G20 commitment made in Rome to put an end to the provision on international public finance for new unabated coal power generation by the end of 2021. So this is what we did, what we are doing. And maybe, Nick, I close by saying a word about the initiative we launched last year called Finance in Common. Maktar was referring to it. This is even bigger, and in my mind, this is one of the places where we could invent post-2025 climate finance, sustainable finance. Very simple idea, gathering all public development banks in the world, multilateral, regional, national, subnational. We did the research. We found, in all your countries, we found 530 public development banks in the world that we would like to organize and structure as some sort of a global network for public investment that are so much needed right now. The figures are simple. What about aligning $2.5 trillion for climate and SDGs? Why not allocate SDR somehow in this network to even increase this capacity? And of course, not for themselves, but because they are so deeply rooted in their constituency that they can't mobilize all willing actors, first and foremost the private sector and private finance. And certainly there's a discussion that is starting here in Glasgow, very strategic, very important, hopefully between GFANZ, Mark Carney, BILT, NGFS, the central banks, and finance in common, FIX, the public banks, that Minister Srimulyani, we would be happy to present by the G20 summit next year in Indonesia. And so not only deliver for 5 years, but open a perspective for the fight against climate change on the financial side that is way more ambitious and structural than what we did for now.
Thank you, Remy. We're very short of time. We only have 2 minutes left, but we'll try to take 30 seconds each for the last words. I count myself in the 30 seconds. I think that you've heard today the beginnings of the story and real substance in the story of the post-2025 framework, which we should be putting in place now. First, deliver on the 100 billion, clear, strong, keep it moving upwards, but create something much bigger with different strands that you don't try to aggregate into one number, but each of those you build up very strongly. And with the conditions created in the countries, as Srimulyani described so clearly, we can really put together a framework which would be commensurate with the trillions which we face. We heard the elements today. Thank you very much for doing that. And over to you, Srimulyani.
Well, I think the progress that could be and should be made within the next 2 years is how to do this, the innovative blended finance. Because there are, as Makhtar mentioned, that we have all party interests, they have funding, but they are actually governed with a different governance structure and principle. So now the question whether the world facing with this common challenge of climate change, dealing with one very specific commodity that is CO2, the carbon and the carbon price, are we going to be able to align whether this is going to be on a governance structure, prudential principle, or even in this case, risk appetite and risk assessment, that then we are going to be able to create a truly blended finance. Because when you talk about $1 trillion, I don't think that we are going to get this $1 trillion from the ODA, from the public finance, that's everything. Private sector appetite is so different. Financial institutions, they are also governed by a different prudential. So if the next 2 years we are going to be able to create this kind of platform of governance, risk assessment, as well as then ability to then move forward of this real catalytic fund, then we do really have a hope for this 2030 of the NDC, that is Paris Agreement, as well as the net zero emission. Thank you.
Thank you, Makhtar. Thank you.
2 things that I would like to leave with us. Let's not forget adaptation. Only 1.6% of private investment is going to adaptation. We will not be able to have an inclusive approach on change without adaptation. So let's put back adaptation at the center of our conversation. Secondly, we have to ensure that countries are investing really in sectors that will, on the long term, allow them to adopt new technologies. We have been talking about technology adoption, and it's very interesting to see one of the fastest technology adoption has been in emerging economies. So let's make sure that we create the condition for them to adapt that. A last thing is that why I'm excited about this new bond that we launched today is that we cannot have climate change, reduction of CO2 without inclusion. We need to work about in a holistic way to ensure that it's social bonds which are addressing not only emission, but also ensure that nobody is left behind.
Thank you. And I should have underlined from the beginning that all this discussion was about mitigation and adaptation and development and how we wrap those together. Remy.
Nick, I fully agree with your framework. I didn't know, but I think that's the way forward. 2 parts. We certainly have to strengthen, clarify, push for the public part of it, meaning, of course, deliver the 100 billion, no discussion. Second, I really invite all governments to clarify and strengthen the mandate set to their public banks, meaning align with the just transition priority. Push for adaptation. Within IDFC, we multiplied 5 times finance for adaptation, and insert nature in the framework. So that's for the public side. And second point, if the public side is clear enough, then turn to the mobilization of private finance. And on this, we need a mandate. We have no clear mandate on mobilizing private finance. We need targets. We need common language methodologies with the private sector. There are too many in the room. And we need a very serious discussion about risk sharing. Who will take which risks? So for now, we have pilot, we have experiences. It has to consolidate into a discussion at a strategic level to really scale up in the mobilization.
Thank you. Could I ask you to thank the panel? We've had a tremendous discussion. I hope we've showed that there is a way forward.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Lord Stern, for moderating not just a very illuminating panel, but also a panel which stuck to time. So thank you. We are actually achieving the near miracle of being roughly on time in this afternoon's proceedings. It was a very interesting panel indeed. I must say one of the key themes that's come out is the need for blended finance and risk sharing as people look forward. But having talked a lot today about what should happen, what could happen in terms of climate finance, we're now going to move to a presentation to talk about what actually is happening. The co-facilitator of the Standing Committee on Finance, Seni Nafo, is going to give us a presentation, or the presentation on the 2020 biennial assessment and overview of climate finance flows. And then after that, we're going to have essentially an open mic session moderated by Archie Young, the UK lead negotiator for COP, where all of the ministers, members, governments can ask questions as they wish. But I'll come back in a moment and introduce that. So, Seni, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gillian. If the Secretariat can pull the presentation. And maybe have a screen towards me so I can see the presentation as well before changing slides. Is someone? Can someone turn the screen? Thanks. Well, thank you. I'll just start my presentation if this is not possible. So, distinguished delegates and colleagues, I'm making this presentation on behalf of the Standing Committee of Finance of the UNFCCC, which is the body of experts advising the COP on finance matters. This is on behalf of my co-facilitator and myself. This report was supposed to be available last year, but because of COVID restriction, we had an additional year, and hopefully we've done a better job. So I'll start first of all with the biennial assessment, which consists of two products: a summary table, a summary, and an underlying technical report, which are both available on the UNFCCC website. And the summary is also contained in the report of the Standing Committee. The report has four main chapters. A first chapter, which consists of methodologies related to tracking finance, climate finance. A second chapter, which is the overview of climate finance, but for the period of 2017 and 2018, including initial identified trends. This is our fourth report, so we have more data points. We're starting to identify some of the early trends. And then a third chapter, which assesses the climate flows, consideration of impacts, assessing also the effectiveness and the composition of the finance. A final chapter, which is new this year, and has been mandated by COP25 in Madrid is a mapping of information related to what we call here 2.1C, which is making financial flows consistent with the Paris Agreement. We do consult extensively in making this report. So I'll dwell straight into what we call our onion diagram, which seeks to capture whole the global finance which is there, and so it has the global total climate finance, and it also what it does is to divide around public, private, international, domestic, and major economic sectors as well. And at the core, the very small circle at the core is the funding through UNFCCC funds, which is the Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Fund. So in terms of numbers, what we have seen and we have reported is that there's been an increase by 17% over the 2017-2018 period. An increase of 17% of climate finance. The figure that we have is about 775 billion over that period, which is largely due to increase in investments for the renewable sector and sustainable investments. And we are aware of the fact that as much as there's a cost decrease in renewable energy, we're able to actually achieve more in terms of install gigawatts. So for instance, in 2018, 100% more renewable energy capacity was commissioned compared to 2012 with only 22% increase in investment. Now, on flows from developed to developing countries, we have there's been an increase of flows through all the channels. Developed countries here do, under the UNFCCC, provide reporting, and there's been a 13% increase of climate finance, which stands now at 36.3 billion. UNFCCC funds and other multilateral climate funds have also increased their approvals, 39%. This is mainly due to the Green Climate Fund. But however, there's been a drop in the replenishments of both the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, and the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, over that period. There's been significant increase of finance by the Multilateral Development Bank over that period, about 50% increase compared to our last biennial assessment in 2015, and the flows stand at about $25 billion per year. The support is largely geared towards mitigation, and adaptation only receive about 20 to 25% of that total. And adaptation finance, most of the resources are actually grants. Grants seems to be the key instrument for adaptation finance. We've also, in our report, identified access as a key challenge. Countries, national entities are really struggling to access the finance which is available, and this is an element which needs to be addressed. And we'll do we'll do more in-depth work into identifying the critical piece of the access gap. All right. We've also have climate finance in the context of the other flows of finance in general. We like to call this our drops diagram, where you can see that as much as climate finance stands at about 775 billion, other flows dwarfs climate finance, especially, in particular, financial flows to GHG intensive activities, which remain still high, and is definitely going to be an issue if we're going to achieve the Paris Agreement objectives. Now, on the last chapter, which is mapping the initiatives or the information available on making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low green gas emission and climate resilient development. We've seen, as I would see on the chart here, from 2015, there's been an exponential increase in initiatives from different policy, investor, corporate stakeholders, and which we did welcome, but at the same time, there's been a bit of challenge in making sense of the diversity and tracking all the initiatives which have been launched since. Other findings in the reports are pertaining to the challenge that we have in assessing the real impacts of most of the initiative, and clearly the risk of greenwashing remains a key challenge as well. But we do acknowledge the challenge even for most of the initiatives in including specific metrics and coming up with metrics to be able to track and to be able to serve as indicators of success. So we'll continue working with the initiatives as they develop more their own accountability framework and their whole transparency framework. So we hope to be able at our next report to come up with a lot more information on transparency and accountability. So more work also needs to be done in promoting inclusivity and geographical representation across the various initiatives. And it's also important to ensure that just transition financing is incorporated in the approaches to align with the goals of the Paris Agreement, including supporting vulnerable developing countries. Most of the initiatives are low GHG emission reduction centered, and we're not seeing that many initiatives on the other side, on the climate resilient pathway as well. So we'll be continuing that work with all the initiatives. We welcome their willingness to work with the SCF and with all our partners. I thank you, and Gillian, back to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that very lucid explanation of what's actually happening to climate finance. It lays out very clearly the need for more to happen and the need for potentially the mix to change too. But we're now going to move to the last part of this afternoon's proceedings, today's proceedings, which is essentially an open mic session, and one might say almost a family therapy session, when anyone in the family of governments here of the United Nations wants to make comments, they can do. The person who's going to be chairing this, moderating this, is Archie Young, who is the UK lead negotiator for COP, and he will be pulling together the comments, the interjections, all the thoughts that people in the audience who are ministers wish to share, and then be wrapping up the day's proceedings. Minister Sharma, unfortunately, has been pulled into other negotiations and discussions, so Archie Young is now going to be taking the floor and moderating the last part of this afternoon's proceedings. So over to you, Archie Young.
Your Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, welcome to the open plenary discussion at this high-level ministerial dialogue on climate finance. And thank you, Gillian, for welcoming us all and for keeping the conversation going. We have heard this afternoon from 3 distinguished panels covering the full range of actions we will need to reach the level of finance to deliver on our shared goals. I would like to thank the speakers, and I look forward to your responses. I'm also reminded of the importance of us ensuring that we deliver strong outcomes from COP26. Your Excellencies, I will shortly invite you to take the floor to make interventions of no more than 3 minutes. Should time permit, we will also invite observer organizations to make interventions at the end. But I'm sure, like me, we would all like to hear from observers. So I do encourage you to leave enough time so that their voices can be heard. Parties and observers are also invited to submit a written statement, which will be published on the UNFCCC website. In your interventions, I would like to invite you to address the 3 overall questions that also built the basis for the preceding panel discussions. For the sake of clarity, I will read them again. Number 1, what specific actions can ministers take to further enhance the scale and effectiveness of climate finance, in particular with regard to the $100 billion per year goal? Number 2, what progress has been made to develop a financial system to support a net zero and climate resilient future? And what steps can finance ministers take to ensure this progress continues and delivers sustainable growth for developing countries? And thirdly, how can governments and other actors, including MDBs and the private sector, significantly scale up private finance mobilization to developing countries for adaptation and mitigation? And what role should public finance play in improving the conditions for this shift? Now, there is a lot in those 3 questions to pack into 3 minutes, but I very much look forward to what I'm sure will nevertheless be lively discussions. And with this, I would now like to invite heads of state or government to speak. I see Turkmenistan. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, dear participants. First of all, on behalf of the delegation of Turkmenistan, let me express my gratitude to the organizers of the 26th session of the Conference of the Parties, the government of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland for the warm hospitality and conditions provided for the fruitful work of the conference. With the adoption of the Global Sustainable Development Goals, Turkmenistan is actively working to achieve them. Based on the recommendations of the Convention and its obligations under the Paris Agreement, Turkmenistan is making practical efforts in the field of climate change. First, due to the introduction of modern technologies in all spheres of the economy, greenhouse gas emissions are reduced. Secondly, the National Strategy on Climate Change, the National Strategy for the Development of Renewable Energy until 2030, and the new law of Turkmenistan on renewable energy sources were adopted. Thirdly, millions of tree seedlings are planted annually in Turkmenistan. So in 2020, 25 million seedlings were planted, and in 2021, it is planned 30 million. Fourthly, the national determined contribution of Turkmenistan has been prepared within the framework of fulfilling the obligations under the Paris Climate Agreement. The commitments proposed in it are a confirmation of Turkmenistan's ambitious goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 in key sectors of the economy. Special attention in this context is paid to reducing methane emissions. In this regard, we welcome the new initiative of the Global Methane Commitment and express interest in studying it in detail with a view to possible substantive participation. We plan to achieve zero growth in greenhouse gas emissions in the medium term, starting in 2030, and in the long term, annual significant reductions in emissions. We expect to achieve these indicators both at the expense of our own financial resources and with the technical and financial support from international organizations and financial institutions. We expect that systematic, constructive international dialogue on climate issues will further continue. In this context, we welcome the efforts of the UN Secretary General to implement the solutions reached, and we are ready to provide maximum assistance in solving climate problems. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Turkmenistan. I would now like to open the floor to ministers to invite statements on behalf of party groups. Party groups, would any party group like to take the floor? If no party group wishes to take the floor, I will now invite statements on behalf of ministers. Ministers, you're invited to take the floor. I see Grenada.
Thank you, Chair. It is a privilege to have the opportunity to speak for Grenada at this very important fourth ministerial dialogue. But at the same time, it is somewhat disheartening that we're still talking about how to meet the $100 billion per year goal in 2021. We were doing the same at the third, second, and the first ministerial dialogues going back to 2014. I appreciate the hard work of Germany and Canada for their leadership with the Climate Finance Delivery Plan, and welcome the progress that has been made with new announcements. It outlines some hope of delivery, but still not until 2023, it seems. So we have to be honest. Delivery on the $100 billion has been disappointing. Developed countries have dragged their feet and are now still being dragged to the $100 billion finishing line. Except, as we all know, the $100 billion is really just the starting line, a floor for the much more transformational levels of climate finance that are needed to support mitigation and adaptation efforts, and to address loss and damage as we suffer the worsening impacts of a warming world. And the starting pistol needs to be fired loudly at this COP to set in place the concrete steps to deliver a new collective quantified goal prior to 2025 that does justice to the scale of the impacts and needs of vulnerable and developing countries. Our faith and trust needs to be restored by these steps here in Glasgow. And these steps are particularly critical for small island developing states in the areas of adaptation and loss and damage. On adaptation, it's a sprint against time, and the main barrier for us is lack of finance. It's a difference between being able to plan and hoping for the best. We need certainty in the scale and flow of financial resources to make the critical infrastructure investment plans that are so desperately needed. Which is why we're calling for a balance of adaptation and mitigation financing at a time where climate financing flows to small island developing states have decreased significantly to only 2% of global flow, and not to mention the significant challenges in accessing even this. Our protracted discussion on the $100 billion is also distracting us from formally progressing the discussions on the new collective quantified finance goal, where billions must scale up to the trillions that are really needed, notwithstanding the discussion that took place in the last panel session. An option to be seriously considered is the IMF's allocation of special drawing rights to developed countries and the redirection of a portion of this in support of the most vulnerable countries in their fight against climate change. Forgive my simplification, but all that's required is the political will of the wealthiest and biggest emitting countries to make this happen. On loss and damage, we're already reaching limits to what adaptation alone can achieve. Additional and dedicated finance for loss and damage is no longer a theoretical discussion, but something that is needed now if we are to cope with the destruction we're already locked into by the actions of others. This needs to be recognized explicitly in the process to be established at COP26 that will frame the new collective quantified finance goal. Much more can be said, but I'll end here. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Grenada. I now give the floor to the Republic of Korea. Republic of Korea, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Chair. This is a party group statement on behalf of the Environmental Integrity Group, comprising Georgia, Liechtenstein, Mexico, Monaco, the Republic of Korea, and Switzerland. We are a very diverse group, including countries who provide and who receive support. And some of us actually do both. We jointly believe that the most important action we can take to further enhance the scale and effectiveness of climate finance is to work in effective partnership models. We also firmly believe that while mobilization of additional financial resources is a global effort, developed countries should take their lead. We recognize that many efforts have already been taken to move toward a financial system that supports a low-emission and climate-resilient future. Various actors from the financial sector have started to engage, begun to shift their portfolios, and have announced net zero pledges. Many initiatives have been launched to develop metrics and methodologies to measure the consistency of financial flows with a low-emission and climate-resilient development pathway. We sincerely welcome these efforts and hope that we can move toward harmonized methodologies and metrics to track our collective progress in the future. Unless we set the right economic incentives to shift the spending priorities of the private sector and ensure the availability of sufficient private capital to move toward a climate-resilient and low-emission future, we will not be able to achieve the goal of the Paris Agreement. The mobilization of private climate finance has been one of the biggest challenges. De facto public-private mobilization ratio have stalled or even decreased over the past few years. In order to achieve the goal of the Paris Agreement, government and other actors, including multilateral development banks, the Green Finance, Green Climate Fund, and the Global Environmental Facility will have to work on much more innovative models to mobilize the private sector. We have to create the right enabling environment in developed and developing countries to drive low emission and climate resilient private investment. On behalf of Korea's national capacity, I would like to suggest 3 things to increase climate finance. First, greater global effort to $100 billion goal. $100 billion goal is critical in building trust among the parties and strengthening our drive on climate action. The developed countries' recent contributions are certainly encouraging in this regard. To take part in the global action, Korea will continue to contribute to the climate funds, including the $300 million to the GCF, and also move more than triple our green ODA until 2025. Second, stronger institutional framework to urge private participation. Public finance must act as a financial leverage that mitigate the risk involved with the climate project. At the same time, the government must improve the policies and regulation to crowd in private investment. Korea is working to strengthen the institutional foundation to mobilize private resources by phasing in the mandatory disclosure of ESG information and preparing a green taxonomy. Third, effective use of the mobilized resources. It is important to strengthen country ownership and capacity of developing countries where projects are implemented to ensure effective use of the mobilized resources. To this end, Korea signed an agreement today with the UNFCCC to contribute $3 million to support developing countries' climate response. Lastly, it is now time to put our words into actions. This being the last COP meeting to host ministerial conversation on long-term finance, I hope there will be tangible progress toward the $100 billion goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Republic of Korea. I now give the floor to Mongolia.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, for giving me the floor. First of all, on behalf of my delegation, I would like to express my thanks to the Secretariat for organization of this high-level dialogue on climate finance. Everyone knows that financial issue is key for all countries, particularly those most vulnerable to climate change and those who have much less capacity in terms of economic development to tackle with emerging challenges with many uncertainties associated with global climate change. My country, Mongolia, as a country listed as below middle-income country, cannot fully rely on assistance of donor countries and international donor agencies. We have to make extended effort to engage private sector and international financial institutions to develop joint projects to address most key and sensitive issues on climate change, covering both adaptation and mitigation issues. We have made some progress on that, but still outcome is modest because those international financial mechanisms like GCF, Adaptation Fund, GF, are needed more support from the advanced countries who benefited mostly from the development in the past based on carbon economy, contributing much to the global GHG pool in the atmosphere. I do hope that this COP26 would be a good chance for increased pledge of financial contribution to the GCF Adaptation Fund, GF, and others, so that those international mechanisms could serve their role in adequate level, assisting most vulnerable developing countries to address challenges not only in respect of adaptation, but also to enable them to increase GHG reduction in their NDC target. Only in that way we can make some step forward, and we need to act, not only to talk. And we should understand that there is no vaccine for climate change like for COVID-19 pandemic. Only a prepared and adequate financial mechanism could serve as a vaccine for climate change. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much, Mongolia. I now give the floor to Uganda. Uganda, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to restrict myself to 3 areas. The first one is the issue of effectiveness of climate finance. I firmly believe, and my country does so, that the current financing mechanism does not deliver effectively at grassroots levels. Probably not more than 50% of the funding currently available reaches the grassroots for implementation. So one area of actually creating effectiveness is ensure that these bottlenecks within the processes are addressed so that at least 70 to 80% of this funding gets to the grassroots levels. The other issue is the challenge of access. Accessing whatever funding is available for developing countries especially is so difficult, and we would want to see simplified mechanism for accessing this funding. Thirdly, we welcome the private sector And we welcome all these innovative mechanisms for syndication, getting concessional loans, etc. But as we go through this, we need to bear in mind that some countries are already overburdened. They cannot even borrow at the moment for development issues. Therefore, the issue of the social bond should be given priority for such countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uganda. And please, I do encourage colleagues to request the floor by pressing the button on the microphone in front of them. Group chairs and ministers, we do welcome your comments. I now give the floor to Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. On behalf of the ministerial delegation and government of Papua New Guinea, I am privileged to be here today to present a paper on behalf of my government. Pacific Island countries have been allocated a total of USD 1.111 billion of international climate finance over the past 9 years for a period 2010 to present. Although there are long delays in the disbursement of the approved funding, particularly from multilateral climate funds, from the USD 1.11 billion, approximately 48% or USD 538.56 million was from bilateral sources and 52% from USD 572.94 million from multilateral sources. The core of the multilateral funding to PICs came from the Green Climate Fund, of a total of USD 359 million for project funding in 11 FICs and 5.5 USD million for readiness support in 10 PICs, with the balance coming from other key multilateral funds such as the Adaptation Fund, Global Environment Facility, GEF, LDC Fund, Special Climate Change Fund, and GEF Trust Fund, and the Climate Investment Funds. Most of the funds were allocated as grants and focused largely on adaptation measures. In 2016, PNG engaged with the GCF for the first time after the historical Paris Agreement in 2015. The government of Papua New Guinea has also gone a step further by providing the GCF with its privileges and immunities regulations, which paves way for GCF to partner with Papua New Guinea in meeting its climate change aspirations. For the last 6 years, Papua New Guinea has accessed GCF funding for readiness purposes. More than $5 million has been accessed to develop the PNG preparedness and readiness to begin accessing the funds. One of the key deliverables include the development of GCF country program, sets out key mitigation and adaptation priorities for the country. We are now in the process of formulating 2 readiness proposals that are focused on moving our financial management systems, building our capacity to further develop projects in the pipeline, having direct access and operationalizing the GCF country program. Highlight key areas: failure on the part of accredited entities or AEs to carry forward national priority projects, programs and adaptation and mitigation as per the GCF country program. We need GCF to encourage AEs to align their entity work programs with GCF country program to fast-track the process of developing projects that are currently in the pipeline. There is a concern that there is lack of cooperation and capacity in country by AEs who fail to support Papua New Guinea's GCF country program. The GCF board and secretariat should consider simplifying the funding proposal template to allow Papua New Guinea to cross-reference GCF country programs, NDCs, NAPs, SDG, 13 roadmap or other equivalent analysis in demonstrating overall national vulnerability to the impact of climate change. I specifically request for the Green Climate Fund to consider developing a special set of criteria to enable us to qualify and successfully draw down its financial support for priorities, including displaced communities experiencing losses and damages due to severe impacts of climate change. The amount of fund accessed already by Papua New Guinea is largely insignificant, and it is of great concern. Papua New Guinea is trying our best to access funding. However, with the lack of cooperation by AEs, it is a concern. Proposal a way forward. The next step now is to look at the option of establishing direct access entities to access this GCF. We would like GCF to work closely with Papua New Guinea in the process of establishing DAEs in the year 2022. Request GCF ED to send a stronger message to AEs to reprioritizing and align Papua New Guinea's GCF country program and move projects in the pipeline. PNG's Papua New Guinea is planning a development partner roundtable, and we would like to invite GCF to attend virtually. Encourage GCF to work with PNG or Papua New Guinea to access GSC funding to address the plight of communities being faced with losses and damages to climate change and communities displaced due to severe climate change impacts. Papua New Guinea climate finance. Climate finance for the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. Implementation is very important. Finance is a critical tool for implementation of countries' NDCs and overall climate action to meet the objectives of Paris Agreement and the Convention, and for ambition to stay below the 1.5-degree trajectory by 2030. Predictable and expedited financial flows from both public and private sources at domestic and international levels are required to implement the NDCs and national adaptation plans. Papua New Guinea is confirmed in contributing and working together to ensure we keep the Paris Agreement goal within 1.5 reach. We believe that mobilizing resources and forging partnership is key to the actions that we should undertake locally to fully implement the Paris Agreement. Another important issue is the global goal on adaptation. The GGA must be based on an understanding of what resilience means for individual countries. Parties must think according to their local realities. How will the GGA inform and direct action and funding to make people and places in their communities more resilient? The challenge now is the implementation of the National Adaptation Plan. The Green Climate Fund must ensure to make available funding for the implementation of the priorities set out in the NAP and the NDCs. GCF to make available funding for the implementation of NAPs, and then consequently the speeding of the process to make those funds available. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Papua New Guinea. I now give the floor to Bangladesh. You have the floor.
Yeah. Thank you, moderator. Yeah, for the last few years, we have been hearing many different panels. We welcome the great efforts undertaken by the two ministers from Germany and Canada for developing and sharing the delivery plan with us. We feel that that should serve as a good basis for our discussion. Now, the questions that you have posed, responding to your first question, let me share first the idea of the scale of finance. The Honorable Philippine Minister has mentioned about the definition of finance, for example, and there is a huge deficit for the last 2 decades. We have not been able to agree to a commonly agreed understanding of what climate finance is. So there is a kind of a distrust between developed and developing country parties. So I think COP presidency can do a good job if we can reach to an understanding on that issue. My second point is the delivery plan has mentioned about different sources of climate finance, including alternative sources. But in the report, we find only the discussion about private finance and financing from the multilateral development funds, development banks, and no discussion about the alternative sources. The African Development Bank president has mentioned about the externalities, negative externalities. And Lord Stern, we are very lucky to see Lord Stern today, who for about 15 years back has strongly argued for internalizing the externality as the greatest climate change being the greatest market failure. And there is no, in the negotiations, there is no discussion about this basic, fundamental, cardinal solution to climate financing, that is internalization of externality. That is where we want to focus on, which can really scale up climate finance. If we can, for example, put a little penalty on the global public bets that cause climate change. But still today, we are funding the problem, not the solution. The Fiji minister has mentioned just in the few hours back in the session that per minute $11 million is subsidized for fossil fuel. So this is the problem. We are funding the solution, problem, and not yet the solution. That is where we need to focus, because we believe from Bangladesh delegation that public exchequer will not be able to provide sufficient funding. That is why we need what we call kind of some few auto-generation mechanisms, some kind of little levy which can automatically generate billions of dollars a year, and that is the ultimate solution. Now, coming from the to the point of grant versus loan, the delivery plan has got 10 lofty principles. We will be very happy if those lofty 10 principles are implemented effectively. But there is the problem that even for the LDCs, for example, we have about more than 2/3 of climate finance delivered as loans, not grants. And this is creating kind of a new climate debt trap, together with the already debt burden that these low-income countries already have, and in addition to the COVID-19 assault on our economies. So we need to, we request the COP presidency to take a serious look at the grant portion of the climate adaptation finance, particularly for the LDC countries. Now coming to the next point, for example, ODA, increasingly ODA is shared now as climate finance, because we understand the fact that there is, it is great difficult to kind of differentiate between adaptation and development. But what we are witnessing is that on the one hand, ODA has been stagnated for the last 5 years, even going down, but increasing share of ODA is delivered as climate finance, and that is kind of a double injustice, because the mission of ODA and climate finance are absolutely different. So this needs to be taken care of. And then about adaptation financing. Adaptation is anticipatory. Private sector cannot deliver anticipatory financing under Article 9.5 of the Paris Agreement. We know. Public sector faces difficulty in providing even the ex-ante information. We have been negotiating for these few years about Article 9.5. And private sector adaptation does not generate immediate revenues. And also it is largely a public goods nature. That is why we cannot expect that private sector mobilization will be huge for adaptation. So in real sense, for adaptation, we need public finance. And then finally, about this third point, how can the government offer actors, including multilateral development banks and private sector? Okay, then that I mentioned that private sector can do a very good service in mitigation, because you can put mitigation initiatives under the market instruments. But private sector and market instruments are not efficacious enough for adaptation. That is why for adaptation particularly, we expect that public finance should be the main source, and only for the LDCs, only we expect grant-based financing, not any kind of loan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bangladesh. I now give the floor to the United States of America.
Chair, thank you very, very much. We all know that finance is absolutely critical to tackling the climate crisis. No government in the world, none whatsoever, has enough money to be able to deal in billions and pretend we're going to solve this problem. It's just not going to happen. The fact is that it is only by bringing trillions to the table that we get the job done. The UN Finance Report makes that crystal clear. They have said that we have a deficit annually of about $2.6 to $4.6 trillion. And that's for the out years, all the way for 30 years. So if we're going to meet the urgency that the scientists tell us we must meet, which is to say, we need to have a 45% reduction in emissions over the next 10 years. And 65% of global GDP has signed up to do exactly that. The US, UK, EU, Canada, Japan, South Korea, South Africa. And this is certified by external entities that say, yes, they'll be able to meet those goals if they get it done. So the fact is that that means that 35% is not yet into that mode. And part of the challenge is going to be finding the capacity to be able to accelerate the transition for some of those countries. 20 countries equal 80% of all the emissions. 20 countries. If we could get those 20 countries on an accelerated basis, then we can win this battle for sure. Well, the trillions of dollars that have been now put into play are the only way we're going to get that done. But you have to be able to deploy those trillions of dollars, because some of them operate under fiduciary restraints. Some of them, obviously, they can't invest unless there's a risk evaluation, a de-risking, unless we have blended finance, unless there's a mix with philanthropy. And then you can create an investment that is known as a bankable investment. Now, I know some people think, oh my gosh, why should it be an investment? Well, because the power sector earns revenue. The power sector has the ability to be able to finance these things. The transportation sector earns revenue. It has the ability to be able to finance. And the fact is that, as I said, no nation has the ability to fill the need that we have. Now, public finance is still going to be a vital element of this. I don't want anybody to think I'm taking that off the table. I'm not. We worked very closely in the last days with Japan and with other countries. And Japan put forward a $10 billion commitment over 5 years, $2 billion in a year, which as a guarantee, which it will be, allows you to leverage $8 billion. And that means that for 2022, we will then be in keeping with the $100 billion commitment. I also want to emphasize that the importance of public finance is precisely why President Biden pledged to work with Congress to quadruple our climate finance after he'd already doubled it. He's now quadrupling it by 2024 to $11.4 billion, including a 6-fold increase in adaptation finance. And yesterday, President Biden also announced that the U.S. would be making the first ever contribution to the Adaptation Fund. And we're pleased that following that announcement, together with other countries, we will now be on track for the $100 billion per year, starting at the end of next year, which is the first budget cycle after Donald Trump shut it down for 3 years that we're able to begin that process. Now, I know some people would say, well, we don't think that's quick enough, but let me just say, folks, we ourselves knew this was going to be a very tough goal to achieve and ambitious. But the reality is this: as soon as donors understood that we were likely off course by $20 billion for the year, then 1 year out, donors engaged in an unprecedented effort to scale up our climate finance. And to give you a sense of this effort, in 2019, there was around $63 billion in public finance. I'm only talking about public finance. That's not the money that gets counted, that gets mobilized by a country. But in public finance, there was $63 billion. In 2025, these new pledges will bring the public finance, not the money that's energized, that will bring the public finance to about $94 billion. So that means that in the last several months alone, donors have pledged $30 billion in new public finance to go forward. And that's pretty unprecedented. So finally, let me just say that President Biden said on Monday that mobilizing finance at the scale required is going to require all hands on deck. And that means that going forward, countries who can contribute will need to be part of the global effort that was enshrined in Paris. But even with these efforts and new donors, it's going to be impossible to believe that we get where we need to go in the next 10 years on that alone. This Finance Day has made it clear with the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, we now know that we have pledges for an extraordinary $130 trillion of people who are prepared to put that money into legitimate investing. And I think that puts a burden on all of us to make sure we can make it legitimate. It will mean we need to sit down together and calculate with philanthropies around the world how we take the first risk, how we get the multi-development banks to perhaps restructure in some ways that they can do greater drawdown and make more money available, all of which can bring that private sector trillions to work and get this job done. I'm absolutely confident that we can do it, and I want you all to know that the United States will work day and night and continue in good faith to work with all of our partners in the effort to make this happen. We're within striking distance now of getting enough countries at 1.5 degrees with the ability to transition. And if we'll focus on the 20 developed countries that provide most of the emissions, we will get the fastest advance in the fastest way possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, United States of America. I now give the floor to Cuba. You have the floor.
Buenas tardes. Distinguidos panelistas, ministros, delegados, Agradecemos las ponencias e intervenciones realizadas en este importante panel. El debate y las decisiones que en cada COP se negocian sobre el tema del financiamiento es una de las cuestiones más relevantes para el cumplimiento de los compromisos en el enfrentamiento al cambio climático. Los países en desarrollo necesitan soluciones urgentes y definitivas para lograr la disponibilidad de financiamiento adecuada, transparente y adicional que se necesita. El alcance, la escala y la velocidad de la financiación climática por parte de los países desarrollados es claramente insuficiente. Los trabajos hacia una nueva meta global de financiación necesitan ser acelerados y profundizados. Urge pensar y repensar la arquitectura financiera global, o lo que es lo mismo, lograr una nueva arquitectura financiera innovadora que sea más justa, transparente y equitativa, basada en el principio de responsabilidades comunes pero diferenciadas y respectivas capacidades. Se necesita asegurar la visibilidad y disponibilidad de recursos financieros suficientes para satisfacer las necesidades y prioridades identificadas por los países en desarrollo, tanto para la mitigación como para la adaptación y las pérdidas y daños asociadas al clima. Sobre esto último, significamos la necesidad de que los estados insulares puedan contar con apoyo para la recuperación de daños ante los efectos de eventos meteorológicos extremos, como es el caso de los huracanes. Es necesario también simplificar los mecanismos para el acceso a los fondos disponibles. Cuba ha logrado hasta el momento la aprobación de 2 proyectos por el Fondo Verde para el Clima en materia de adaptación, lo cual es de particular importancia para nosotros. Pero por nuestra experiencia en el proceso de presentación, análisis y aprobación de los proyectos, es muy largo el camino y a veces escabroso. Finalmente, deseamos reiterar en este diverso y abierto debate sobre las finanzas climáticas nuestro rechazo a cualquier medida que puede implicar la exclusión o limitación para algunos países en desarrollo de recibir fondos a proyectos internacionales para implementar sus obligaciones en virtud de la Convención y el Acuerdo de París. En este sentido, los fondos, agencias y mecanismos financieros en general que existen deben asegurar la transparencia y no discriminación de ningún país. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias también, Cuba. Now I give the floor to the Maldives. Maldives, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I fully concur with the sentiments expressed by the Minister from Grenada, a fellow small island state. I have a few points. One, on financing, it is very disappointing that the promise made in Paris is unfulfilled, especially in light of the clear and an urgent need to massively scale up adaptation in countries like ours. We trust, that though delayed, we will see 500 billion in total delivered by 2025, and also a massive scaling up based on the needs of vulnerable countries like the Maldives. Access to climate finance cannot continue to be mired by excessive red tape. Bureaucratic delays to the approvals of climate projects in the Maldives have meant that the ground realities have changed by the time we get the go-ahead for implementation. The financing architecture is currently not aligned with the urgency we require. Second, we would further like to stress that grant-based adaptation finance should be prioritized. 100 billion was only a compromise we made in hope of greater ambition to limit warming. Currently, we have neither. And now, with the scenarios of the climate crisis more clearly laid out than ever, there is a greater need for new, additional, and predictable financing to meet the urgent adaptation needs and to limit temperature rise. An increased new collective goal must be set well before 2025 if we are to maintain temperature rise at 1.5 degrees, as per the latest science. Finally, we also recognize that it is currently easier to raise and attract financing for mitigation, whereas adaptation is not seen as something that provides a profitable return on investment. The Maldives would argue otherwise. In line with the scenarios that we face, the cost of inaction now is far greater. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Maldives. I now give the floor to Panama. Panama, you have the floor.
Buenas tardes. Agradecemos el espacio para garantizar este diálogo con los distintos actores financieros y a la vez para garantizar el desarrollo y el reconocimiento a los distintos fondos y financiamientos y oportunidades que se le dan a los países en desarrollo. Sin embargo, está claro que no se ha alcanzado el umbral de los 100 millones de dólares y que existen brechas que deben reconocerse y abordar una relación con un logro para distintos objetivos, aumentando las finanzas públicas, aprovechar los flujos y las inversiones privadas para la mitigación, a fin de permitir una acción ambiciosa en todo el mundo, proporcionar una financiación pública basada en subvenciones para la adaptación a fin de reducir vulnerabilidades a los efectos adversos al cambio climático y mejorar así la resiliencia para minimizar los impactos futuros. De igual manera, este diálogo es importante con los distintos actores, en particular para garantizar las mejoras, los mandatos, los distintos incentivos que llevamos a cabo para garantizar la acción climática transformadora y ampliada, adoptando definiciones y mecanismos importantes para alinear los acuerdos del París. Adicional, establecer desarrollos e implementar instrumentos que atraigan actores privados, es decir, garantías, capitales, nuevos inversionistas y fuentes de financiamiento, y utilizar el financiamiento de manera estratégica para llevar a cabo acciones climáticas transformadoras y construir así entornos y mercados climáticos propicios y utilizar un financiamiento concesional en casos en los que las inversiones sean críticas para lograr los objetivos climáticos. Pero no pueden tener distintas ventanillas, debemos tener acciones consolidadas. Adicional, fomentar productos y servicios que tengan un perfil de emisiones más bajo, que contribuyan a la reducción de los gases de efecto invernadero y sean más competitivos, aumentando la demanda de financiamiento. Dichas oportunidades para que los bancos comerciales, las entidades financieras puedan ofrecer mejores servicios a sus clientes, es importante incluir una inversión con tecnologías, con productos y servicios de bajas emisiones y promover las futuras inversiones de infraestructura verde. Adicional, nuevas fuentes de generación y producción de energía limpia. De igual manera, garantizar nuevos proyectos y financiamiento para la reducción de carbono. Por lo tanto, los bancos, las entidades de financiamiento tienen una nueva oportunidad para garantizar y posicionarse y así apoyar las distintas estrategias. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Panama. I now give the floor to the European Union.
Thank you very much. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the EU and its 27 member states, and thank you for the very interesting panels and for bringing Lord Stern here, because he provided a big picture and put climate finance in the broader context. We need to deliver on the 100 billion, no question about it, but we also need to be able to move beyond that. Because climate finance, in the end of the day, and to keep the 1.5 degrees alive, that needs transformational flows, and that means making sure that all finance flows are aligned with the Paris Agreement's objectives. Now, turning to the 100 billion question, we are, of course, very disappointed that we did not meet this mobilization goal in 2020. But in 2020, over 23 billion of public finance was committed by the European Union and its 27 member states to support developing countries to reduce emissions and to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And by adding other sources, notably finance mobilized directly as a result of public finance, the EU's contribution was about 30 billion in 2020. Close to 50% of that funding to developing countries was dedicated to either climate adaptation or to cross-cutting actions involving both mitigation and adaptation initiatives. And close to half of that total funding was committed in the form of grants. Now, the EU and its member states, we continue scaling up our international climate finance. And many of us have made concrete pledges as part of the Climate Finance Delivery Plan that was published in late October, as well as our leaders here in Glasgow. And the EU and its member states, we constantly have increased our public finance contribution and will continue to do so. A few words on the effectiveness, and obviously here we need to work in partnership, and there needs to be the right operating environment and the right prioritization in the recipient countries in their national strategies and development plans. But effectiveness, really important part of that is also the decreasing unit costs. And here I would like to applaud the Standing Committee on Finance's fourth biennial assessment, which actually also looks very carefully at these decreasing unit costs, which actually means that these new investments will go further. And when the decline can on average is about 20%, it actually shows how much greater these impacts can be. Now, I've also heard a lot about the new collective quantified goal, and let me reassure everyone that the EU and its member states, we are very committed to also getting an outcome on that agenda item here in Glasgow. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, European Union. Now, can I request if there are any further ministers who would like to take the floor, please signal you wish to do so now. Sorry? Now I give the floor to Japan. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Japan announced a commitment at the G7 Cornwall Summit in June to provide support worth $60 billion, including both public and private finance, over the 5 years from 2021 to 2025. Yesterday, at the World Leaders Summit, Prime Minister Kishida announced that Japan will provide up to $10 billion in additional assistance over the 5 years, including both public and private finance. The total is $70 billion in 5 years. Divided by 5, it is $14 billion, or 14% of the annual $100 billion. The additional commitment would include our contribution to the launch of the Innovative Financial Facility as we partner with the Asian Development Bank, among others, to support the decarbonization of Asia and beyond. Prime Minister Kishida also announced that Japan will double its assistance for adaptation from the level of its previous commitment under the ACE 2.0, in the framework of the above-mentioned total commitment. The new amount for adaptation finance is approximately $14.8 billion over the next 5 years, both public and private. Japan will further strengthen its support to adaptation activities in developing countries. Japan supports the projection and delivery plan of climate finance mobilization released by developed countries ahead of COP26. The announcement yesterday by Prime Minister Kishida demonstrates Japan's determination to take the lead in the mobilization. We will work together with other developed countries towards the achievement of the $100 billion goal as soon as possible. To achieve that goal, it is extremely important to mobilize more private finance. Japan will further support efforts to enhance enabling environment for mobilization of private finance in developing countries, and will also further leverage bilateral public financial institutions and international organizations. In particular, Japan appreciates that the Climate Investment Fund launched this ambitious initiative in support of the decarbonization efforts by developing countries. Japan strongly supports such initiatives. We are concerned about access to climate finance. The Green Climate Fund plays an extremely important role here. We hope that access to climate finance will be improved through the capacity building support and prompt implementation of projects by the GCF in developing countries. Japan already pledged to contribute up to $3 billion to the GCF and will continue to support its climate actions in developing countries. We need to recall the objectives of long-term climate finance in the context of meaningful mitigations actions and transparency on implementation in developing countries. We need to make sure that finance provided contribute effectively to climate actions in developing countries. In this critical decade, we should be jointly pursuing efforts to limit temperature rise to 1.5. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Japan. I will next give the floor to China, and following that, the floor is open for any further parties who wish to take the floor. China, you have the floor.
谢谢主席。中方呢想就会议讨论的3个问题发表几点看法。首先呢，中方注意到了有关资金问题的报告和努力和进展，但是呢，我想首先强调呢，实现1000亿美元目标，首先还是要提高各方面的实现这个目标的政治意愿。气候资金是维护各方政治信任的重要基础，是实现公约和巴黎协定目标的重要基础，也是基于科学的历史责任。这是发展中国家关注的核心问题。发达国家应该履行义务和政治承诺，向发展中国家提供充分、可持续、可预测和强化的资金支持，并且要进一步突出筹集资金透明度以及核算报告体系的科学性。我们讲很多的钱，100万，但是首先要从1000亿起点。第二点，长期资金是各方达成的重要共识，代表了发达国家继续向发展中国家提供气候资金支持的政治意愿。因此，应该在公约及其巴黎协定政治共识下长期存在。中方认为，发达国家应该尽快地填补每年1000亿美元气候资金的缺口，而且以此为起点，应该制定2020年后更具雄心的气候资金目标，以及明确的时间表、路线图，从而提高气候资金的透明度和可预见性，持续更大力度与减缓雄心和力度相匹配的资金支持，是我们实现净零和韧性未来的重要前提。最后，中方欢迎各方参与气候资金动员与融资，同时认为要有效发挥公共资金的基础和撬动的作用，并在遵循市场规律的基础上，发挥银行和私营部门的积极性，以扩大气候资金的来源和保持可持续性。在这方面，还要进一步地突出在适应和应对气候变化能力建设领域公共资金的重要作用。谢谢。
Thank you very much, China. I now give the floor to Nepal. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Excellencies, distinguished delegates and colleagues, Nepal is one of the most vulnerable countries to the impact of climate change. And this year alone, Nepal lost 100+ lives and 10 million worth of properties due to climate-induced disasters. The people from vulnerable categories, mostly the indigenous people, women, people with disabilities and marginalized community have been still suffering from those loss and damage due to added hardship and the time poverty. Further, our country is losing from 1.5 to 5% GDP per year due to climate change. And these events are increasing in numbers and are unpredictable. And it is projected that Up to 13% of country's GDP is lost by 21st century in worst case scenario. Nepal is already having to address this issue by having to cut its limited budget from other sectors to respond to these increasing extreme events. We have been continuously expressing our difficult situation in various meetings and engagements. In this particular context for Nepal, climate finance is key. Commitment to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020 was made long ago, but these commitments have not been made yet. Meeting these targets or even going beyond is important to help assist vulnerable countries like Nepal in addressing climate change. Financial resources committed must be predictable, adequate, and accessible so that we can align our plans accordingly. Nepal has duly prepared its second NDC, National Adaptation Plan, long-term strategy for net zero, and national climate change policy to guide our climate actions. And now, what we need is financial resources to take these plans into action. Nepal would like to emphasize grant and full cost financing to climate actions, especially for adaptation actions and loss and damage. And aid the process to receive this access must be an easy, quick, and the simplified process. And direct access to international funds would help strengthen the capacity of our countries as well. And finally, Nepal would like to thank all the partner countries that have been supporting Nepal and request for enhanced continuous support. I thank you.
Thank you, Nepal. And I have refrained from coming in and commenting after people's interventions because I want to hear from you. But may I just express my sympathy and solidarity for the lives lost, as you mentioned, and as others have mentioned today too. I see no more parties requesting the floor, in which case I will open the floor to observers. Would any observers like to speak? In which case, if no parties nor observers would like to speak, I will move to wrap up. And can I thank you all for a very productive plenary discussion? And I think the interventions that we've heard today, they show how much collectively we have achieved, but also the scale of the task that remains. We all know that finance underpins our ambitions on climate. And that is why the UK COP26 presidency has made it one of our top priorities for COP26. The $100 billion goal per year has been a personal focus of the COP president. And we recognize that countries need clarity and predictability on finance. And that is why the COP president asked State Secretary Flaspart and Minister Wilkinson to lead the delivery plan on the $100 billion per year goal. Now, we have heard both frustration and recognition that the delivery plan was not able to show that the goal would be met by 2020. But we have also heard that the progress made has been welcome. And we have seen some more commitments in recent days. But there is still much more to be done. Beyond the $100 billion, we have heard clear messages today on the importance of continuing to scale finance to the levels needed to deliver. We have also heard the importance of improving access to finance, increasing adaptation finance, improving transparency and accountability, and making the support that is already provided more effective. We have also heard the need for private finance to play a greater role, not at the expense of public finance, but in combination with it. And that there is a real unprecedented will from many actors to make finance from all sources flow to low emission and resilient development. One of the key messages we have inferred from this afternoon's discussion is the importance of working together across these crucial 2 weeks. Through the negotiations, and I feel this acutely, we have a full agenda on finance to deliver on. And this speaks to many of the issues that we have discussed today. This is particularly true as we consider the future of finance discussions in the UNFCCC. How we create space to talk about both the very real rising needs of developing countries and the many ways in which we need to act to ensure support and investment flows to them. How we move from words to action, and we heard that today, moving from words to action in increasing adaptation finance. And how we build the right space for that trust that the 100 billion will be delivered with transparency and clarity. Thank you all for your time this afternoon. And it's now my pleasure to hand over to the Executive Secretary, Patricia Espinosa, for some final words. Over to you.
Thank you, Archie. And I want to start by thanking all the ministers and the high-level representatives that took part in this very exciting, I would say, high-level ministerial dialogue on climate finance. I have been in this position as Executive Secretary for 5 years now, and I can tell you that clearly this has been the most exciting high-level ministerial dialogue on climate finance that we have had. So that means that in many ways, momentum, awareness, recognition of the importance of fulfilling the commitments that were made in Paris and even before Paris, if we talk about the 100 billion, are absolutely crucial. Thank you to the UK presidency for organizing this session. Dear friends, since the beginning of this process, almost 3 decades ago, the issue of finance has been at the heart of the climate change regime. And it remains, as we have seen today, a topic of great importance within our process and outside of our process. By the way, I was also very pleased to see how many high-level representatives from different institutions made their way to Glasgow to come and share with us their perspectives, their commitments, and what they intend to do into the future. So we know that finance, especially the provision of financial support to developing countries, remains one issue that is key to the success of the climate negotiations underway in this conference. This means that it is ultimately really key to what our future will look like. And it has been said again and again since the beginning of the conference and before, and I guess it will continue to be stated that without the necessary finance, we will not be able to embark on the transformation that is needed to achieve the 1.5-degree goal. Dignitaries, high-level representatives have made the point also that we are talking still in terms of billions of dollars when we need to be speaking in the trillions. So this is, and we need to recognize it, what the magnitude of this transition requires. It has become clear also that the resources are available, that there has been a very successful mobilization in the developed world of resources to recover from the effects of COVID. And that we now need to see the same level of commitment to support developing countries in addressing climate change and allowing the transition. And we all are facing not only the climate emergency, we are facing also the COVID emergency and the economic emergency or the economic difficult situation depending on the different countries that has derived from the effects of COVID. So we need more ambitious commitments and the fulfillment of past pledges. And this is, of course, very important regarding the outstanding commitment to mobilize $100 billion to developing nations by 2020. We are still far from where we need to be. I want to thank the Minister of Natural Resources of Canada, Jonathan Wilkinson, and Germany's State Secretary at the Ministry for Environment, Nature, Conservation and Nuclear Safety, Jochen Flassbart, for their efforts, their really very tireless work in order to put together the $100 billion delivery plan that was released last week under the leadership of the presidency. I want to echo the words by Archie regarding the delivery plan. There is a recognition that there is progress. At the same time, there is also frustration because the goal that was originally established is not being fulfilled. I think that we should consider this plan not an end, but a beginning. And I find also that the recommended paths forward that are included, that are contained in the plan, are noteworthy, especially towards ensuring developing nations that they receive the support that they need. So the plan states that developed countries must continue to steadily scale up climate finance by fulfilling their pledges and making higher pledges. And this is absolutely crucial to drive the climate agenda forward. So I hope that we will be able to see these scaled up pledges very soon, and that should be a very important sign to build confidence now for our negotiations, but also into the future. There is also the point in the plan about the need to increase finance for adaptation, as well as the increase of grant-based finance for the poorest and most vulnerable countries. The plan suggests as well that it is essential to remove barriers and improve access to climate finance. So I think the points that need to be addressed are very clear, and I certainly hope that we will find a good way of addressing them here, but also hopefully getting the support of colleagues in the finance community to address the issues that they need to address within their competencies. So I encourage also all of you to really explore the opportunities that are outlined in this plan. I would like also to bring to your attention a paper that was published today by Sir Nicholas Stern and Amar Bhattacharya regarding the challenges that we face to finance a sustainable and resilient future. They provide a clear assessment of where we are, where we must go, and how we can get there, including concrete, quantified actions on grant financing, concessional funds, financing from multilateral development banks, and the role that the private sector is called to play. We must, as they so fittingly put it, deliver climate finance of the right scale, right kind, and in the right time. I really recommend you to have a look at it. I think it may bring some valuable inputs to our discussions. They are also very clearly stating that if we are really dedicated and committed to drive this transformation, we need to transform the billions to trillions, and we need the involvement of all stakeholders. Otherwise, it is going to be very difficult. We have learned a lot since this high-level ministerial dialogue started. We have engaged in constructive dialogue around issues such as the mobilization of finance, the effectiveness and impacts, the question of adaptation finance, and many more. And COP26 must be where this work comes together and we make substantive progress on the intense finance agenda that Archie has already outlined. We are at a pivotal point of the process in our collective efforts to address climate change in our overall point in history. So I kindly invite you to really look at the big picture, to the common welfare of humanity in the long term, and I am hopeful that by the end of the week, of week 2, not this one, but the next week, greater clarity is provided with respect to a way forward on the issue of climate finance. So let's all work together to make this happen. Thank you, Archie, and thanks to the UK presidency for holding this ministerial dialogue. Over to you.
Thank you, Executive Secretary, for those encouraging and thoughtful words. And just as we close, we've talked about what's happening in the negotiation rooms. We've talked about what's happening in boardrooms, in banks, in governments, in institutions around the world. And what gives me hope is the fact that I think the message is becoming clearer and clearer, that every decision that every government makes, every institution, every consumer must take climate change into account, both in terms of the impact it may have and also the impact of climate change on those decisions. Just this morning, on the other side of the world in New York, my wife was chairing a discussion on climate finance. Everybody is focused on this issue. Everybody here has a lot of work to do, and we look forward to doing it with you. Thank you very much. This meeting is now closed.